Well, it seems that the big book of Eldar has finally landed. Let's talk Craftworld's Harlequins and Ynnari, and how they'll be playing with their new 9th edition book. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about this enormous new Codex Aeldari, which I think out of the 9th edition codexes might just be one of the single biggest updates since the edition launched and the first Space Marine Codex. We've had really quite a lot of leaked rules from this one over the past few months. It's been really good to see everything put together and get a bit of an impression as to how the rules are going to work in practice. As with a lot of the 9th edition books, they really do seem to have put a lot of time and effort into each and every datasheet here. Almost everything has had really big changes, and as I mentioned, it's not just the Craftworlds in this book, it's Harlequins, Ynnari, and even Corsairs as well, so really quite a lot of fun stuff in here. In the review, we'll talk through each section of the codex in turn. I will be focusing on the match play rules as per normal, talk about what's changed, what's looking interesting, and what are looking some of the most interesting picks out of each section. We'll start with the contents of the codex, then go through all the Craftworlds rules, the Harlequins, and the Ynnari in that order. Loads to talk about here, so let's jump straight into it. So overall, Codex Eldari is one of the single biggest Games Workshop publications of 9th edition. It's fairly equal size to the Space Marine Codex with its ridiculous amount of datasheets, and it's a bit more of a composite and in-depth book than many of the other codexes released. There are all the normal things, a section on lore, miniature galleries, and crusade rules for the Asuryani, Harlequins, and Ynnari, and then of course enormous rules and match play sections for all of those. For the Craftworlds, also known as Asuryani, we have the army rules, Strands of Fate and battle focus, both of which are interesting and impactful, a lot more so than Ancient Doom and the old version of Battle Focus were. There's Craftworld Rules and rules for far-flung Craftworlds, the normal Warlord traits, relics, stratagems and secondary objectives, a new Exarch Powers system which is a points cost upgrade for individual squads, 3 disciplines of psychic powers, runes of fate and fortune for the Farseers, and then runes of battle for the Warlocks, and then a massive amount of revamped datasheets, new Shroud Runners, a new unit of Corsairs, and a whole load of fun and interesting stat line boosts. A lot of units have gone up in points slightly, but I think that's more than compensated for by their massive increase in abilities on the board. For the Harlequins, they get many of the same things. Their detachment rules grant them the Harlequins Panoply, Rising Crescendo, a luck dice mechanic if you're a pure Harlequins army for some rerolls, travelling players to allow you to field independent Harlequin detachments, some Warlord traits, relics, psychic powers, stratagems and secondary objectives, though admittedly a few less than their Craftworld cousins. Their masks have been replaced by rules for Saedaths, only 3 different alternatives, light, dark and twilight. The options are fewer, but they do seem more powerful at first glance. Pivotal roles have become points cost upgrades for the Shadow Seers, Troop Masters and things, and then similarly many revamped datasheets, many of which have got a bit stronger. The Ynnari's rules kind of work similar to a weird version of an Eldar Craftworld. They get an attribute, Warlord trait, relic and stratagem and things, but they also gain a bunch of interesting rules, their unique datasheets, their Revenant Discipline with 6 psychic powers, and some interesting special rules to focus on making mixed Harlequin or Drakari detachments, though it does seem that they're now forced to focus a bit more on fielding Craftworld units than they were before. Finally, I wasn't entirely sure exactly how Corsairs were going to manifest themselves in the new book. It does seem that they're mainly just limited to 2 datasheets, though they are quite easy to field within other armies whether they're Eldar Craftworlds or Drakari, and the datasheets are fairly fun and flexible. Overall though, it's a whole ton of stuff, so let's jump straight into it and start with the Craftworlds and all of their rules. So starting out, we have core rules that affect most Craftworld detachments. They have lost Ancient Doom, their inbuilt bonus against Slanesh units, which to be honest was kind of situational as an army-wide special rule. They've got a new one called Leaders of the War Host. You can only have a maximum of 1 autarch per detachment, though I don't think that that's going to be as onerous as it is for some armies. I think usually you're only going to want 1 at most. Generally I think that Psychers will be the thing that you'd be more tempted to spam. Troops units get objectives secured as before, though it's relevant that the Dire Avengers have become elites, so that could be a bit less good for them. Still though, fairly standard in terms of OBSEC stuff. Perhaps one of the really big new rules though is battle focus. This one applies to the vast majority of Asuryani infantry and jet bikes, though not all of them. Things like Dark Reapers or the Wraith Units don't normally get this. You can, funnily enough, get it on a few vehicles though via the Vectored Engines upgrade, so you could have things like Fire Prisms or Falcons doing a bit of move shoot moving as well. The rule comes in 2 parts. The first one is kind of similar to how it was before, which allows you to advance and shoot assault or pistol weapons as if you were static. It means that things like Howling Banshees can still fire their shuriken pistols to full effect, even when they're trying to advance and charge. The interesting new bit, though, is if you've just made a normal move, so no advancing or falling back, then you get to move d6 inches after the unit has shot. You can't use the move to get into a transport, and if you go through area terrain at any point, you get a -3 to that roll, which means you basically have a 50-50 chance of going nowhere. Still though, it's a really powerful special rule to have on quite so many units throughout the army. It means that the Eldar are going to be rushing forward ridiculously quickly, and there's a lot of potential for some very gamey jump shoot jump things going on. Say you could have some jet bikes just nosing around the edge of terrain and using their battle focus to move solidly behind it, even if they don't venture into it altogether. Even if you do have to move through terrain, there's at least a small chance of getting some reasonable distance, and it's going to be pretty handy whenever it works out. Some units can be even better with it though. Things like Warp Spiders, which get a 2d6 inches battle focus move, they're going to be a nightmare to get to grips with. Very powerful, though I do think that the area terrain thing is pretty sensible to stop the mechanic being abused too much. Finally, just for general rules, shuriken weapons have seen a small makeover. Most of them are at least AP -1 now, if not better. And on wound rolls of 6s, they now always boost your AP by -2, usually winding you up with either AP -3 or AP -4 overall. Quite nice, having a little bit of AP at base is pretty handy. The other really big army-wide special rule though is Strands of Fate. This one's the one that you get if your entire army is Asuryani, though Harlequins can be included still by their Travelling Players rule, which basically allows them to field a detachment of Harlequins without breaking army-wide special rules like this. It can only be done as a patrol detachment though. In any case, I think Strands of Fate feels very Eldar indeed. At the start of each battle round, you get to cast some runes by rolling 6d6. You look at the results and you choose to retain a certain number of them. That depends on the battle size. Say for a standard 2,000 point game, you'd be keeping 4 of them. Each one of the dice that you roll corresponds to a different in-game roll as per this table. A 1's an advance, 2's a charge, 3's a psychic test, 4's a hit rolls, 5's are wound rolls, and 6's are saving throws. You have to use these dice up within the battle round and substitute a single dice before rolling as per the table. So say if you rolled really weirdly and you'd rolled just 4's, you'd have to use those Strands of Fate for hit rolls, and you wouldn't be able to use them on any other types of rolls. Basically, when you're about to make an important roll, you could choose to substitute in some Strands of Fate dice, and those dice that you substitute in count as a 6. It's basically a way where you could auto-pass a save, or auto-pass a wound roll, or substitute 1 6 into a charge or psychic test. You would only be able to do this with one of the dice though, you have to roll the other one of those normally. Still though, really powerful. I think just about all of them are really quite useful. Punching in automatic 6 inches of advance is really handy. It makes long charges really reliable, particularly ones out of deep strike where you're going 9 inches. It can basically guarantee you casting most normal psychic powers, which is awesome. In general, it's going to be far more useful to use them for wound rolls than hit rolls, but sometimes wound rolls have extra effects on 6s. For example, things like Ranger Sniper Rifles giving you a mortal wound. Finally, saving rolls of 6s are pretty awesome, usually going to be auto-passing that save unless your opponent's really high AP. Very valuable if you've got a monstrous amount of damage coming in if you fail it. I really quite like the mechanic. It feels very Eldar and manipulating things to go your way, but limited to just a few dice per turn, I don't think it's going to be a completely broken mechanic. A few commanders and things can manipulate these a bit. For example, Farseers can allow you to re-roll them, and there's a Warlord trait to allow you a bit of manipulation for them as well. Overall, it looks pretty good fun, a good reason to run a pure Asuryani detachment, though maybe not as absolutely vital as things like maybe Power from Pain for Drukhari are. Next up, seeing as we're talking Eldar, I thought we'd start with the Psychic Disciplines. So these are the 3 that are available for the Craftworlds. The Runes of Fate are basically only able to be cast by Farseers, and most of their blessings allot to Craftworld Asuryani units that are core or characters. For some reason, if you roll quite high on the cast, quite a lot of the rolls of 10 plus allow you to cast at a greater range, though I must admit I'm not really too convinced that that's that useful. You still want to be within range of casting it for the unit that you're going to cast it for, as you certainly can't count on rolling a 10 plus. In any case, Guide is now only Warp Charge 6 from 7, usually has 18-inch range, and now affects core or character units to re-roll their hit rolls. Doesn't mean it has a little bit less potential for really massive units. Things like War Walkers or Fire Prisms aren't going to be able to make use anymore. Still though, a really powerful buffing power. Doom remains Warp Charge 7, 18 inches unless you roll that 10 plus, and again it does only affect core or character units now, They get to reroll wound rolls against the target for this spell. Still very, very powerful, but no longer maybe quite as much of a big focus laser that you can put on one unit. It won't affect some of the heaviest guns in the army, things like Wraith Knights or Fire Prisms and things. Fortune's Warp Charge 6 now, previously it was Warp Charge 7. Again, a core or character unit gets a 5+ Feel No Pain type save. Executioner returns, still at Warp Charge 7. One enemy unit takes D3 mortal wounds, and again an extra D3 if you slay a model. It's less good at sniping characters now though, as you can't target characters with less than 10 wounds. Will Asuryani is 18 inches and Warp Charge 6. That one's a bit more use in my opinion now, as it gives a core or character unit objective secured, really handy for snatching some points, and it also lets the unit auto-pass morale tests and shoot while doing actions, all of which could be quite situational, but I guess doesn't seem the worst to have around as a general purpose utility power. This one only seems to need an 8+ to cast at 24-inch range. Finally, Mind War is 18 inches and Warp Charge 7. Again, you roll off and add your character's leaderships. If yours is higher, they take that many mortal wounds as per the difference, and if you cast on a 10+, you roll 2d3 rather than d6, adding a bit more reliability. Still potentially a 1 for sniping enemy characters, though I still don't think very reliable. I think for the most part, a lot of these will remain very usable. Guide, Doom, Fortune and Executioner I think will still be the mainstays, but arguably quite a lot of them do have a bit less use now, not being able to be quite as good for anything that doesn't have core. I think they'll be a bit less general purpose, and maybe depend a little bit more on what units you're actually trying to support. Alternatively, Farseers can draw from the runes of Fortune as well, and Fortune can also be used by Spirit Seers now. Fateful Divergence seems a very easy pickup indeed. Warp Charge 6 Psychic Power to just gain 1 command point straight up. That one's easily worth casting every turn if you've got something else useful to use on the discipline. Witch Strike is Warp Charge 5. This one allows successful wounds in melee to cause 1 mortal wound and the attack sequence ends. It usually affects the Psyker themselves. For the Corsair Psyker it must actually affect the Psyker model, and Warlock units select 1 model within the unit. I can't really see this one being popular enough to take generally though. Ghost Walk is potentially really quite powerful. A core or character unit gets +2 to charge. It means if you're jumping in units via the webway, this one seems like almost an auto-include for anything coming out of reserve. Should allow you a very reliable 7-inch charge, which if you can spare Strands of Fate dice will be an auto charge. Really powerful that one for delivering some fighty Eldar. Crushing Orb is 18-inch range and Warp Charge 6. You roll 3d6, and on a 4+ for each one the enemy takes 1 mortal wound, and you get +2 to these rolls if the target is a vehicle, monster, or contains 6 or more models. Slightly more efficient damage than Smite if you are targeting one of those favoured units. Focus Will has 24-inch range and is Warp Charge 6. This allows one Psyker to allow +2 to cast and +2 to deny. Seems like an absolutely great one if you're facing off against other Psykers, that one. Both makes your spells a lot more reliable to go off, and also stops the enemy from casting theirs as well. Finally, Impair Senses is 18 inches and Warp Charge 6, and one enemy unit can't be affected by aura abilities. Kind of a bit situational to be honest. Against some armies that's going to be mad powerful. Some armies just won't care in the slightest. Overall, out of these I think Fateful Divergence is a really great one. That could very easily add up to 5 CP over the course of a game. Otherwise I like Ghost Walk for the +2 to charge, Crushing Orb for a bit of damage, and Focus Will could be great if you're going big on the Psychic strategy. For me, I think that both these and the Runes of Fate look usable. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see people running both. Finally, for Psychic Powers we have the Runes of Battle. As before, each one of these is a buff or a debuff, and these can either be cast by Spirit Seers, Warlocks, or the debuff power from the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. Again, a fair few of the buffs are locked to core now, so aren't going to be quite as handy on really big tanks or hard hitters. First up, Conceal grants a core unit light cover, and Reveal allows friendly Asuryani units to ignore all cover benefits. That's not just core units there. Light cover has changed from -1 to hit, going to be better placed on anything with a better save. Embolden or Horrify is now Warp Charge 7 and is far more useful to be honest. The buff allows a core or character unit to get +2 leadership and fighting first, but more importantly the debuff allows -2 leadership and also fighting last. With how powerful Fight's Last abilities are in current 40k, I can very easily see that one being taken quite a bit. Enhance or Drain a Warp Charge 6 and 18-inch range. It gives core units +1 to hit in melee, or again enemy units -1 to hit in combat as well. I guess good with certain units, perhaps fighty units of Wraith Blades maybe. To be honest though, I think I'd rather have Empower or Innovate later in the discipline. Protect or Jinx is Warp Charge 7 and 18-inch range. This one now improves your save characteristic by 1 to a maximum of 2+, so unlike its previous version it no longer affects invul saves. Still a really nice defensive power with the right unit, but certainly a lot weaker than before. Jinx again also doesn't affect invul saves either, and it only reduces the save to a maximum of 6+. In general, between the two of these, they just don't seem quite as powerful. It's maybe a similar story for Quicken or Restrain. It is a bit easier to cast now at Warp Charge 6 rather than 7, but Quicken is maybe a bit useless compared with what it was before. Core or character units do get to move again, but they can't shoot or charge after. Kind of a far cry from when you could just throw a unit of Shining Spears into the enemy's deployment zone and have them wreak havoc. The Strain part now halves their movement characteristic and stops them doing actions. Maybe okay, but maybe not quite as powerful as what other armies get for similar abilities that mess with movement. Finally, Empower or Innovate really is quite a nice combat buff or debuff. It's Warp Charge 7 now, and it gives friends +1 to wound, or enemies -1 to wound. Again, a pretty massive fight phase buff, certainly good for low strength units. Overall, I feel like the discipline is maybe a bit more balanced than it was before. I feel like Horrify is likely to see play for the fight's last thing. That is going to be pretty nasty if it goes down on an important unit. Most of the rest seem kind of useful. I think maybe Quicken on Restrain and Enhance on Drain, and both maybe a bit overshadowed by other options though. Overall though, it still seem good, particularly as they're still going to be quite cheap to field, say 40 points for a Warlock. Next up, let's talk through the Craftworld Stratagems, though quite a few of these are kind of generic Eldar ones, and a fair few can also be used by Harlequins and Ynnari, though the Harlequins do have their own entire section later in the book. We'll go through them when we reach the Harlequins part. First up, for battle tactics, we have the Great Enemy, the anti-Slaanesh one. For 1 CP, Asuryani, Harlequin or Ynnari units can reroll hits and wounds versus Slaanesh units in melee. An enormous fight phase buff this one. This is the kind of one to use every single turn if you do have combat units in combat with Slaanesh. For 1 CP, Matchless Agility can allow you to move 6 inches for battle focus. Really quite a powerful one that this exists, as it means that you can guarantee falling back behind terrain if you have moved out just in front of it. If it's going to make the difference between your unit getting shot or moving safe behind cover, this one's going to be pretty useful. For 1 CP, we have lightning fast reactions, similar to the Drukhari one this one, as Asuryani, Harlequin or Ynnari units get -1 to hit, though you can't use it on monsters like avatars or the Wraith Knight. For 1 CP, Bladestorm is a Shuriken one, as Asuryani or Harlequin units get exploding 6s to hit with Shuriken weapons, only going to be that useful on the really big units like this, maybe 20 strong Guardian squads, 10 strong Dire Avengers, or anything with a whole ton of Shuriken cannons. For 1 CP, we have Martial Citizenry. A Guardian's unit gets to reroll hit rolls of 1. A very small damage boost this one, usually only going to be plus 16%. It can be used on things like support weapons though, if every pip of damage is crucial. Still though, relatively low yield I think. For 1 CP, we have Fire and Reposition. This one's for an outcast unit such as Rangers or the Shroud Runners, and it allows you to move an outcast unit at full battle focus distance, not hindered by terrain. Basically a reliable move shoot move for Rangers in and out of cover as you might expect. Finally, for battle tactics, we have Avengers of Azayan. If Dire Avengers have taken a casualty, then what remains of the squad can shoot again after they've shot, with far more scary Shuriken catapults that could be quite potent. Obviously though, it does rely on your opponent causing a chip casualty and not having done massively serious damage to the unit. For 1 CP, we have Unparalleled Mastery. This allows a Farseer, Shadowseer, if Rain or the Incarnate cast 1 extra power. Often that might be Smite though, unless they've got another way of knowing more powers. For 1 command point, Multifaceted Mind can allow you to cast a power while doing a psychic action. There's a fair few ways that you can be wanting to do psychic actions in the book, so that is pretty handy to keep your buffs coming while they work on some Warcraft Secondaries or something. For 1 CP, the Phoenix Reborn is a Phoenix Lord stratagem. They've been boosted quite a bit, as we'll see, but basically a dead Phoenix Lord stands up on the roll of a 4+, with D3 wounds remaining, and it's once per model per game. With how powerful the models are, this seems pretty much an auto-include for 1 CP when one dies. For 2 CP, we have the Avatar Resurgent. This allows a slain Avatar to fight in death with +2 attacks. Should be a pretty decent chance to drag down whatever it fought against. And for 2 CP, Battle Psychers is a Warlock's one. You do it when you've cast a power with a Warlock's unit, and they get both parts of the Runes of Battle Discipline power rather than just one. Say for example, it could mean that they could empower one unit with +1 to wound and elevate their foes with -1 to wound. Seems like that's a pretty crazy way of swinging a combat. Next up, we've got a few requisitions. There's the standard 1 CP for extra Warlord traits or extra relics. You can get up to 2 extra ones in Strike Force, and there's also a 1 command point stratagem that allows you even more relics. There's a few relic weapons that can be given to Eldar Exarchs, maybe slightly lesser relics, but for 1 CP you get 2 of them rather than 1. Finally, for 1 command point you can upgrade a Warlock's unit to be a Seer Council. You pick a Warlock unit that's got 2 or more models in it. While the Farseer is within 6 inches of them, he gets +1 to cast, and they also gain that annoying can't be shot bodyguards rule whenever he's within 3 inches. Seems quite nice, and a fairly nice way of rewarding Warlocks and a Farseer staying together. For strategic ploys, we have 2 CP for linked fire. This is the very spooky scary fire prism one where you link the fire of 2 or 3 prisms. The prism cannons only fire from the single fire prism, they all use the highest profile, the focused ray one, and you get to ignore invuls with all of those massive AP-5 3d3 damage attacks. It does cost some resources to spend 2 CP for this, but if your opponent's got a model that's really reliant on big invul saves to live, then this could be a very easy way of just blasting it straight off the board. For 1 or 2 CP we have Feigned Retreat. Asuryani, Harlequin or Ynnari units get to fall back and shoot or charge, or both for 2 CP. It just helps add to the sensation that you're never really going to pin the Eldar down. For 2 CP there's Forewarned. This one's the one that allows an Asuryani unit to intercept when they're within 12 inches of a Farseer, and they now get to target 1 enemy unit that's been set up as a reinforcement within 18 inches of them. This one previously had unlimited range, so it is a bit of a nerf, but still very handy at keeping reserves way back from your forces unless they want to get shot. It doesn't have to be a core unit either, so it could be something really massive. For 1 or 2 CP we have a healing one in the Tears of Isha. This one allows a Wraith unit to heal D3 wounds, or 3 if they're within 6 inches of a Spirit Seer. It costs 2 CP for a Wraith Knight, so maybe seems max value on the Wraith Lords perhaps. 1 CP for 3 wounds seems like quite a good deal. For 2 CP we have Fire and Fade. This one can be used by any of the 3 Asuryani, Harlequins or Ynnari units. Anything that isn't an aircraft moves 7 inches after shooting, so basically automatic battle focus that doesn't care about terrain, and can be used on units that don't have battle focus. So if you do desperately want to move, shoot, move with something like a Wraith Knight, it seems that you still can. As well as this, Harlequins can use this one to embark in a transport as well, though regular Eldar can't now. It seems that the trick of jumping Dark Reapers in and out of a Wave Serpent has been put to bed. For 2 CP, Phantasm makes a return. You get to redeploy 3 Asuryani, Harlequin or Ynnari units, and you can also use this to put them in strategic reserve if you want to, if you think that that will be better for them. These stratagems are always really handy. Better lets you counter deploy your opponent and get things in the right position for a good alpha strike, or keep them safe from the enemy's one. Eldritch Storm is a big 3 CP stratagem, and one that I made an entire video about on the channel. You get a Farseer, select a point on the battlefield within 24 inches of them in your command phase, and come the shooting phase, you get to roll a dice for every single unit within 6 inches. On a 2+, they take D3 mortal wounds. That could be a fair amount of mortal wounds straight off the bat, but if you have a Farseer do a psychic action, then it increases the number that each unit takes by 1, and multiple Farseers can do that action if you'd like. Theoretically, if you have 3 Farseers all cast this action within range, every single unit will be taking D3+3 mortal wounds, which is a pretty enormous body blow to an enemy army if they have castled up too much. A very scary move to pull out of the bag, though it does cost a fair amount of CP. Lastly, for strategic ploys we have Webway Strike. It can be used on Asuryani, Harlequins or Ynnari, and you put an infantry or biker unit in Deep Strike, or 3 CP for 2. I'm still not really sure why it costs so much more for 2 units than 1. Typically this is one that I'd use just for the single unit and not bother with the second. Finally, to round off the stratagems we have the War Gear abilities. For 1 CP, Shroud Runners can use Wire Weave Grenades. You pick a unit within 12 inches of them at the start of the enemy move or charge phase and roll a D3. The unit takes that many mortal wounds to a max of 1 mortal wound per model, and then they subtract that number from their move or charge distance. The mortal wounds in themselves aren't exactly terrible, but if it ever presents a charge against Shroud Runners, then that's going to be a massive win. For 1 CP we have Shield Discharge. This is the way that you can discharge the Wave Serpent's Serpent Shield now. You use it in the charge phase, target 1 enemy unit within 12 inches, and they can't overwatch and get -1 to hit in combat. It does rob the Wave Serpent of their 5+ invul and transhuman physiology light rule, but could still be one to consider as the game's winding down. For 1 CP we have the Swooping Hawk Grenade Pack. This one's now a bit of a swoop attack. When Swooping Hawks move across an enemy unit that isn't a vehicle or a monster, you roll 1d6 per Swooping Hawk, 1 mortal wound for every 4+ that you roll, and it's a -1 for enemy characters. Theoretically up to an average of 5 mortal wounds if you have a maxed out squad. For 1 CP we have Starhawk missiles. Asuryani units with missile launchers get to target an aircraft unit. The missile launch you've selected gets +1 to hit and does 2d3 mortal wounds if it does make a hit. A small but meaningful damage boost against aircraft, I guess. Resonator Shard is a ranger stratagem. You pick a unit within 12 inches of the ranger unit, and then basically the barrage weapons, D-cannons, Doomweavers or Shadow Weavers, all get to reroll hit rolls against that unit, so it's kind of the ranger's spotting for one of the Eldar artillery. Requires a bit of setup, but for just 1 CP that could easily be worth it on things like D-cannons. Finally, for the main Asuryani Stratagems, for 1 CP there's fusion charges. This one's 1 if your fire dragons have somehow wound up in combat. 1 fire dragon makes a single attack versus an enemy vehicle, and causes 2d3 mortal wounds if it hits. I guess could be a last desperate move to try and finish off an injured vehicle if they haven't managed to quite kill it with all those very nasty fusion guns. Generally, as stratagem sections go, I think it's quite a powerful one. The vast majority of these look like they're going to be at least useful in some niche cases, though I must admit maybe some a lot more than others. For some of my favourites, Matchless Agility and Fire and Fade both do look really powerful for jump shoot jump type things. Casting an extra psychic power is usually going to be a decent use of a CP. The Phoenix Reborn and Avatar Resurgent both look great if you're using those units. Linked Fire and Eldritch Storm both look quite scary on the damage output front, though admittedly they are quite pricey. And things like Phantasm, Feigned Retreat, and -1 to hit, they're all staples that could really easily be justified. With so many good options to spend command points on, I think getting that Runes of Fortune psychic power on the go for extra CP seems like it could be a pretty decent move. Moving on now, and let's talk about these new Exarch powers. In the previous expansion, they could be substituted in for the Exarch's datasheet ability. Now they're flat upgrades, and they cost a certain amount of points per power. They're generally upgrades for the Exarch themselves. The Exarch then often does confer benefits to their squads, and it's also the way that you get Crimson Hunter Exarchs now. There's only the 1 datasheet for these red planes. Each Exarch power is different. You can't use the same power twice within an army, and as well as the actual listed ability here, they also give you a small stat line boost as well, giving the Exarch +1 wound, +1 ballistic skill if you're from one of the ranged aspects, or +1 attack if you're from one of the melee ones. A lot of them seem worth it just for the powers alone, never mind the extra stats. For Crimson Hunters, to make your plane hit on 2s, first we have the Eyes of Cain for 30 points. That one further allows you to auto-hit against fly units as well. Given the datasheet, that one actually seems kind of bad to be honest, as they're already very good at killing fly targets. Perhaps maybe a bit more interesting might be Strafing Run. That allows them to ignore cover, both dense and light, perhaps a little bit more general purpose, although I think that possibly my favourite might be Swooping Evasion. That's 25 points for a 5+ invul save, and also the +1 ballistic skill and +1 wounds. Seems like a really good deal for 25 points, better damage output, and much better durability. For the Dire Avengers, for 20 points we have Defensive Stance. That allows the unit to shoot in melee. Maybe not so bad, but I'm not sure you'd want to do that compared with just falling them back and then using Feigned Retreat. For 25 points, there's Shredding Fire. This one allows their shurikens to get extra AP on the 5+, not on the 6+. It's not terrible, but again I'm not really sure that's going to be worth the points invested, even on big units. I think perhaps the most straightforward and easy one is just the Stand Firm one. That grants the unit objectives secured, which they lose as they're not troops anymore. Gives you the Exarch upgrades, and also +1 leadership as well. Doesn't seem too terrible for 10 points. For Warp Spiders, for 15 points we have Spider's Lair. This one's quite a fun one. If the unit's entirely within a piece of area terrain, the area terrain permanently becomes difficult terrain for the enemy only. And also if an enemy unit end a move inside the terrain piece, then they take D3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 2+. I think it's maybe a bit more fun than it is super competitive, but it does feel like really quite an evocative and nice rule. For 15 points, there's maybe a lot more reliable Surprise Assault rule. When a Warp Spider squad deep strikes, they get +1 shot with their Death Spinners, so basically an extra 50% damage output for the unit, going from 2 shots to 3. That is really powerful, though I think that you might be giving up their very good battle focus ability as you can't move after you've come in from reserve. Depends on whether or not you just want a big punch coming in from deep strike in a more normal way, or you want them to be jumping in and out of terrain and not getting hit. Finally, also for 15 points, we have Web of Deceit. Instead of making a normal battle focus move, they just basically get to teleport once per game, shooting and then reappearing somewhere that's anywhere greater than 9 inches from the enemy. A free redeploy is really powerful, particularly on threatening units like this. Potentially could be good for doing things like grabbing late game objectives or doing actions as well. Out of those, I think the bottom two ones maybe sound best. The Spider's Lair does sound very fun. For Shining Spears, the first one is Expert Lancers, +1 to hit for the unit when they're on the charge for 20 points. Combined with an extra Exarch attack and a bit more damage, that one seems really good value. They're already super scary when they charge in, they'll be even scarier when they hit on 2s. For 15 points, there's Heart Strike. The Exarch causes 1 mortal wound on every wound roll of a 5+. That's for melee attacks, not ranged attacks, and it seems to pair pretty amazingly with the Paragon Saber. There's a good chance that's going to add up to an extra 2 or 3 mortal wounds every time he fights. Finally, for 20 points, we have Lightning Attacks. This one allows an extra consolidate of 6 inches. Definitely opens up the possibility of doing gamey things after you've fought with them. Though for me, for very similar points, I'd much rather have the direct damage increase. Both Expert Lancers and Heart Strike both look good enough to include for the cost. For the Banshees, there's 20 points for Graceful Avoidance, a 4+ invul on the entire unit. Pretty great to be honest. A small increase on the normal aspect invul of 5+. Makes the unit a bit more tanky and a little bit less hard hitting for the cost. I guess it depends on whether or not you just think that they're going to die anyway, 4+ invul save or no, or if it might actually tip the balance and allow a few more to fight back in combat. For big units of 10 Banshees though, that does seem like a really decent deal. For 10 points there's Nerve Shredding Shriek. This allows you to deal 1 mortal wound on a 2+ when you charge, and that also causes -1 combat attrition. Simple, cheap and effective, this plus an extra attack and wound seems nice. Then for 15 points there's Piercing Strikes, +1 damage for the Exarch model themselves. This one is just ridiculously brutal with the Mirror Swords. That's going to give the Exarch 10 attacks at damage 2, just a spectacularly efficient combat character for the cost. I think for these, any one of them seems like a decent deal. I think my preferences though would be Graceful Avoidance for bigger units, Piercing Strikes for smaller ones. The Striking Scorpions get 15 points for Crushing Blows. That one allows the Exarch to auto-wound non-Titanic models, making him far better against vehicles and things. Might be best on the Biting Blade over the Claw perhaps, as it's got lower strength. 20 points for Deadly Ambush gives you +1 to hit, and extra AP -1 better if the entire unit's within area terrain. Huge benefits across the unit, though being terrain locked I think is just a bit too situational for me. And finally Scorpion Sting, which has some massive potential. That's 30 points, the most expensive Exarch power out of any of the ones for the standard squads, and it means that the squad's Mandiblasters deal mortal wounds on the wound roll of a 5+ rather than a 6. Striking Scorpions get mortal wounds on 6s to wound in combat. Going to a 5 means that a big unit could conceivably very easily dump out anything up to 20 mortal wounds or more. Never mind if you're using a Farseer or something to allow doom on the target. I feel like this one could be very popular. It's basically going to allow Striking Scorpions to blend anything that isn't a monster or vehicle. The Dark Reapers ones I think are all a bit underwhelming to be honest. Bringer of Death allows the Exarch to get 1 extra shot with Reaper launchers or Shuriken cannons, or ignores cover with the Tempest launcher or Missile launcher. Maybe best with the solid shot on the Reaper launcher. Maybe +1 shot plus an extra hitting on 2s as well might be enough to justify it, though I think it's close. Otherwise there's Focus Fire for 15 points for +1 to wound with the Exarch attacks, or 15 points for Reaper's Reach, allowing the unit to move and fire with heavy weapons for no penalty, an ability that they've lost going into the Codex. I think they're all kind of okay damage buffs for the points that you invest. Maybe Reaper's Reach I think is the most interesting of them. At least that allows the squad to be a bit more mobile and not have to worry about standing still. For the Fire Dragons, you've got 20 points for Blazing Fury for +4 inch range to their weapons, 25 points for Burning Heat, shots within 9 inches auto wound the targets, or 15 points for Dragon's Bite. That one's the Exarch's own attacks, getting +2 damage against vehicles or monsters, or +1 damage and reroll wound rolls if he has a Flamer. I think they all seem theoretically useful enough to justify themselves, particularly if you could find a way to guarantee that they're going to be within 9 inches for Burning Heat, but I'm not sure if the Fire Dragon ones really add all that much compared with some of the rest, not just say compare with including an extra Fire Dragon in the unit. Finally, last but not least, we have the Swooping Hawks. For 20 points you have Rapid Redeployment, allowing them to fall back and shoot. I think with their datasheet abilities that we'll get on to, they should be able to stay out of combat though, so maybe a bit redundant. Otherwise, for 15 points there's Suppressing Fire. If the Exarch shoots a unit, you roll 3d6 versus their leadership. If you roll greater, they get no Overwatch, they can't set to defend or do actions. I guess having a chance to stop Overwatch is handy, though it is a bit unreliable I think. And finally 15 points for Winged Evasion, -1 to hit the units, doesn't hurt on 1 wound models that are relatively fragile, though again hopefully with their redeployment they should largely be able to remain out of line of sight. I think ignores Overwatch or -1 to hit both seem like they could be okay, though again maybe not the most essential ones compared with some of the other Exarch Powers out there. Overall though, I do think that some of these are really strong indeed. The Crimson Hunter ones look handy, Shining Spears can get you more melee damage, Howling Banshee's 4+ invul or boosted damage seem great, and the Striking Scorpion one could potentially do an insane amount of mortal wounds against the right target. Really fun little upgrades, they do kind of make the Exarchs feel like mini characters in their own right. Next up, let's take a look at Relics and Warlord traits, and first we'll start out with Relics. A lot of these were a touch underwhelming before, so it is quite nice to allow some of them to get a powerful tune-up. Kurnaus's Bow is a shuriken pistol with 18-inch range, 3 shots, and each successful wound roll with its strength of 5 generates 1 mortal wound. Still not enormous amounts of damage, but should give you 1 or 2 mortal wounds each time you fire, I guess. Far better than its previous truly terrible incarnation. The Phoenix Gem I think is now a lot more worthy of a look. When the bearer is killed for the first time, they set back up at the end of the phase on a 2+ with D3 wounds remaining. A lot more handy for it actually being able to set up meaningfully again, as it means that the opponent can't just immediately gun them down with something else. Maybe not too bad on a character that you want to play really aggressive with. The Shard of Anhrathes is a Relic Banshee Blade or Starglaive. It becomes Strength +1, AP -3, Damage 1, and you get a big D3+3 extra attacks. Quite fun to have an autarch running around with 10 attacks or more. Falchu's Wing allows an infantry model a 12-inch move and fly, and if you move over an enemy model they take D3 mortal wounds on a 2+. Kind of quite handy to get a budget Farseer on jetbike with the foot-mounted one. The mortal wound generation thing is a handy addition. The Fire Saber is another Relic Blade or Glaive, and it becomes Strength +3, AP -4, Damage 2. 6s to hit cause 1 mortal wound in addition to regular damage. A bit more focused on killing Space Marines maybe that one. The Shard seems a lot better at just chewing through hordes of chaff. Sunstorm is a Relic Aeldari jetbike. It allows them to move 20 inches at base and gain Obsec. That's really quite a crazily powerful combo to be honest. While that bike's on the table, the opponent can't be certain that they're going to hold any objective with a non-Obsec unit. Seems like it could be a way of the character sacrificing themselves to get some all-important victory points late game. The Aegis of Eldanesh is an autarch one. Gives them a 2+ armor save and -1 damage. Still though with toughness 3, I'm not sure that's going to make them into any sort of tanky character really, just a bit more survivable than they would be before. Finally for the main relics there are the Weeping Stones. These ones are an upgrade for a Psyker model. While they're on the battlefield you get to roll 1 extra d6 for Strands of Fate, though I believe you'll still only be retaining the same amount as normal as per the battle size. It's just going to give you a little bit more choice as to which ones you get. I guess doesn't hurt to have around. I feel like you're still going to have a fairly decent choice though, even if you don't bother with this. Overall, I'd still say maybe not an absolute standout relic section. The Phoenix Gem seems like quite a nice way to keep a character alive for one last turn. Falchu's Wing maneuverability was already good and getting mortal wounds is great. The bike sounds like it could be seriously annoying for the opponent, particularly if it's on something like an Autarch Skyrunner with some decent melee threat as well. And I guess the Relic Power Swords never really hurt, just hitting the enemy a bit harder. Otherwise, we've got 1 relic for each one of the Aspect Warrior squads. As mentioned in the Stratagem section, it's 1 command point to hand out 2 of these to 2 different Exarchs. Seems like they'd stack quite nicely if you already upgraded the Exarch with an Exarch power, potentially getting even more attacks with an even further buffed weapon like this. For Dire Avengers, you get a Relic Dire Sword with an extra pip of strength. Not the biggest buff to be honest, but Dire Swords give you 1 mortal wound for each successful wound roll inflicted. Against certain targets that will add up to a few more wounds. Dragon's Fury is a defensive one for fire dragons, making an enemy unit -2 to charge. Doesn't hurt, but a lot of the time that might not actually be that relevant. Shadow Sting is a relic biting blade for striking scorpions, basically +1 strength above the regular model. Again, a small buff but not enormous. Crone Scream is a howling banshee mask. Once per game, 1 enemy unit in engagement range takes D3 mortal wound on the roll of a 2+, and if the bearer has already made previous charges in the game, they get +1 mortal wound for each charge that the bearer has made. Half a CP doesn't sound terrible though for a good chance at D3 mortal wounds. Seems like that could make the Banshees have an even bigger impact when they charge in for the first time. The Phoenix Plume is a defensive one for swooping hawks. The regular hawks get a 5+ feel no pain, helps out a little bit with their fragility, and the Exarch themselves gets a 4+ invul. The Spider's Bite actually makes Warp Spider power blades really quite threatening. They're at strength +2, AP -4 and damage 2, and on top of that 6 to wound, cause damage 3 instead. That actually genuinely seems to make the squad into a mini combat unit. Might be able to punch to death a few Space Marines if they do have to get mixed up in it and their Death Spinners haven't done enough work. Kane's Lance is a Shining Spear upgrade, potentially quite powerful though unreliable. On a 4+ when you charge in, the enemy takes D3 mortal wounds and they have to fight last. Really great when that does happen, but far from being a guaranteed thing. Finally, the Shrine Skull is a Reaper upgrade. This one helps an Exarch with a Reaper launcher, and he causes -1 combat attrition if he slays a model. Not nothing, but again I think that's going to be rare that it causes you too many problems. Overall, most of these really do feel like second tier relics to me. Kind of makes sense though if you're only paying half a command point per one. I think my favourites might be the Banshee Mask, the Swooping Hawk's Phoenix Plume, Spider's Bite, and Kane's Lance. Next up we have the Asuryani Warlord traits. Again, it was maybe a bit of an underwhelming section before, and it does seem that they've nerfed one of the best ones, so I'm not sure I'm the most excited about these right now. Ambush of Blades gives you 1 core or character unit within 9 inches, an extra AP by -1 in combat. Not bad for something with low AP maybe, things like Striking Scorpions could be helped out by that, but not so great for all the Aeldari units that have got very good AP on their weapons already. A lot of them do tend to. Walker of Many Paths allows you to reroll 1 hit, wound or damage roll per turn. Probably best used if you've got something that hits really hard in the shooting phase, maybe an Autarch with Fusion Gun or Reaper Launcher perhaps. Falcon Swiftness gives you +2 inch move, ignores difficult ground, and battle focus 6 inches automatically. All handy things, though maybe not enormously standout. I think maybe that 6 inch battle focus could be interesting on an Autarch maybe. I guess you could have one with a Reaper Launcher fire off a shot, then move 6 inches to buff the next section of line, so you could get that reroll ones bubble go further. Fate's Messenger is actually really quite a decent defensive one I think. Each turn 1 failed save becomes damage characteristic of 0 rather than whatever it was. If that goes off against a damage d6 weapon or better, then you might well have just saved your character then and there. The Mark of the Incomparable Hunter is a ranged boosting one. It gives you ranged attacks +1 strength, and on modified wound rolls of a 6 cause 1 mortal wound. Most Aeldari characters don't really have quite enough ranged weapons to make this worth it I think. Again, maybe something like a Reaper Launcher or Autarch could be okay, or could be a buff to the underslung Shuriken catapults on a jet bike perhaps. Finally we have Seer of the Shifting Vector. This one used to be a reroll one, often taken as it allowed rerolls of psychic tests. Now that's gone. Instead it's a command point farming one. Every time a command point spent by yourself or your opponent, on a 6 you generate 1 back, still limited by the normal rules of only getting 1 CP back per turn, regardless of source. I'd maybe weigh this one up against the Runes of Fortune one to generate CP each turn. This one's a fair bit less reliable, but doesn't require you to have to cast a power to do it either. So I think there are some trade-offs. I'd almost certainly want one of the two in the army, it just depends which one you fancy. All in all, as Warlord traits go, I'm not the most enthused about these. Maybe Ambush of Blades paired with Striking Scorpions, Falcon Swiftness to get your buffs or Psychic where it needs to be. Fate's Messenger could at least give you a bit of reassurance against getting sniped perhaps, and the Seer one maybe looks like it's the one that has the most reliable value, but perhaps it's just a bit redundant with the Runes of Fortune allowing you to farm command points very reliably. Next up, let's talk through the Aeldari Craftworlds and what they can each bring to a force. There's 5 main ones, and then a far-flung Craftworld section, which basically is your custom Craftworlds option, allowing you to combine 2 traits of your choosing. First up, we have a Laytok, which used to be -1 to hit at greater than 12 inches. Let's swap that for light cover at greater than 12 inches for everything, and also dense cover gets given to infantry or bikers within terrain pieces if they're greater than 12 inches away. Fairly handy. Light cover is going to be more useful than dense cover against some armies, but worse against others. In addition, they also ignore any modifiers to move at advance rolls. Kind of fits in with the fluff, that one. Not too bad if you're trying to trek through jungles and things. I don't believe that bit works for battle focus though. Their Warlord trait is Master of Ambush and is a bit of a mixed one. 1 core infantry unit within 9 inches can shoot while doing actions, and you get to redeploy 1 unit of Rangers anywhere that's greater than 9 inches away from enemy models and their deployment zone. Both bits are kind of okay, maybe a tiny bit redundant when Phantasm exists perhaps. Their relic is the Shift Shroud of Alansair. This one's an infantry only one, and it means that you can't be shot while you're in cover unless you're the closest and also within 12 inches. Seems handy if you don't have any good units to scream with, and particularly could be quite good to park a character on an objective and make them a pain to deal with unless the enemy can get close. Finally, their stratagem for 1 command point is Pathfind Ambush. This is a kind of intercept one. Basically, a ranger unit gets to shoot them, or if you happen to have some rangers in strategic reserve, they get to turn up within 18 inches and then take a pot shot. I guess maybe situationally handy, but I think in general are going to struggle to make a meaningful difference. You might just do a bit of chip damage or just kill one model perhaps. Overall seems okay, maybe not significantly better or worse than they were before. For Iyanden though, I think they're significantly more use. They still have their leadership combat attrition thing, but now they've got some really quite good AP negation on the go. AP-2 attacks become AP-1, and AP-1 attacks become AP-0. Certainly helps them out with their signature Wraith units. They'll really enjoy that on top of the new -1 damage. Their Warlord trait is a 5+ feel no pain type save, a bit underwhelming on fragile characters like Aeldari to be honest. It's still not going to make them particularly durable if they are exposed. And their relic is that Citronome of Iyanden, a command phase buff to give one spirit host unit within 9 inches +1 attack. A potentially really quite strong buff on a unit of Wraith Blades of any size, and very nice that you don't just use this once per battle. You can also use it to give Wraithguard battle focus as well, which is kind of fun. Potentially could be move shoot moving with those Wraith Cannons and Death Scythes. Finally, their stratagem for 1 CP is Guided Wraith Sight. This allows your reroll 1s to wound on the Spirit Seer to affect any Spirit Host unit in the shooting or fight phase. It's only going to affect the Wraith Lords, Wraithguard and Wraith Blades though, so I guess if you do want to broadcast reroll 1s to wound across the board, I guess that could be useful enough. Out of these, I think they have a pretty reasonable attribute, and really quite a good relic in that Citronome. Certainly going to be an interesting one for running big squads of Wraith Blades. Next up we have Ulthwé the Damned, and they seem to be the Craftworld that Games Workshop want you to play, as they're basically giving them all the good benefits. They get a damage boost by rerolling 1 wound per attack per unit, always going to add up to an extra bit of chip damage here and there. Each Psyker gets +1 to cast its first spell each turn, excellent for an army so heavily reliant on psychic powers. Everyone just casually gets a 6+ invul save, really relevant for things like Guardians or maybe some of the tanks, and to cap it off, a 5+ save against mortal wounds, something that's really common throughout 40k, and that will genuinely lead to a boost in survivability for some units. Overall it's just all round strong, and I feel like Ulthwé is almost certainly going to be the competitive Craftworld to go to. Their Warlord trait is Fate Reader. This allows you to retain 1 additional Strands of Fate dice. Seems a bit more powerful than that relic that allows you to roll an extra one. An extra sub-in roll of a 6 really doesn't hurt. The Ghost Helm of Alhasia is a Psyker buff that allows you to know 1 extra power, and casts of 9+ are undeniable. That's going to give a model a bit more flexibility, and could combo nicely with that cast an extra power command point. Finally, their stratagem is the Discipline of the Black Guardians for 1 CP, and it gives you +1 to hit with any Guardians unit. That's the regular Guardian units, jet bikes or support weapons, all of which I think if they are in big enough units could actually be really quite meaningful. You can get a whole lot of shuriken fire coming out of a Guardian squad if you want to. Generally I think their attribute is by far the best, and all of the other bits seem at least somewhat usable. Ulthwé do seem really good right now. Beotan I think do also have their merits as well. Their attribute is Swordwind, a little bit of damage and mobility, battle focus rolls count as 3 inches, so do advances, and you also get to reroll a single hit roll per attack. Still seems far weaker than Ulthwé, but certainly by no means useless. Their Warlord trait I think is perhaps one of the very best ones that the Eldar get in general. Natural Leader allows 1 core unit to reroll hit rolls, a really reliable damage buff that you don't even need to cast Guide for, or it means that you can have 2 units rerolling hits if you do want Guide to be used elsewhere. Their relic, the Spirit Stone of Anhrathes, is also a really useful buff. A Psyker model knows an extra power and gets to reroll 1 test per turn. I think that's better than the Ulthwé one in my opinion, particularly as Farseers lost their innate reroll. Finally, their stratagem for 1 CP is Wrath of the Shrines. This was an aspect buff, and it gives aspect warriors exploding 6s to hit. Each hit roll of a 6 generates 1 more hit, usually going to be a 25% increase in damage output. Sometimes could be well worth it, particularly if you're using very big aspect warrior squads with 10 men in. I think Beotan is another one of my favourites to be honest. Swordwind's useful enough, but their trait, relic and stratagem all are really solid, particularly the Warlord trait and relic. Finally, for the main big craft worlds, we have Same Han. Their attribute is Wild Host. It allows them to reroll charge rolls and also fall back and charge. Basically, Same Han is going to be very tempting if you are building a very melee heavy army. Their Warlord trait, Wild Rider Chieftain, gives them +1 attack and a 6-inch heroic intervention. Certainly wouldn't hurt on an autarch with a laser lance, and you could back that up with the Talisman of Tion Char. If you're charging or heroic intervening, you get +1 strength, +1 damage, and an extra AP -1 on your attacks. Pretty brutal when you've got such a massive potential threat range on a jet bike mounted character. Finally, their 1 CP stratagem is Warriors of the Raging Winds. That allows a biker unit to advance and charge. Basically ridiculous charge threat range on a Shining Spears unit. Between their automatic 6-inch advance and the reroll charge rolls, that means that you're going to have an average 30-inch or more threat range. Seems tempting enough if you are thinking about running a bunch of Shining Spears. Overall seems good enough to me. Kind of weird though how they only really help out the melee jet bikes, they don't really do a lot for the standard Guardian ones. Finally, to round out the Craftworld option selections, we've got the far-flung Craftworlds. These ones get to pick 2 traits from a big list. There's really quite a lot to choose from. This is the first half. They don't get any relics, warlord traits or stratagems aside from the first one, and most of them seem to be trading out a bit of flexibility for being quite good on a few certain units. I think in general though they're not going to stack up too well against a big combined trait like Ulthway. First up, in the Footstep of Ancients allows you to copy a main Craftworld trait. You can use their main warlord trait and stratagem, not very useful rules wise, but kind of more for fun and fluff. Then we've got a lot of Eldar Children. Children of Cain give you 6s to wound, get +1 damage in combat. Good for units with a whole flurry of low strength attacks like Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions. Children of Morai Heg give you +1 to hit for your units below starting strength, kind of similar to part of the Ynnari benefit which we'll get onto later in the video. Children of Prophecy really is quite a good psychic buff, allowing you to reroll any number of 1s or 2s on psychic tests or deny the witch. That one is a really solid trait if you are looking at fielding a bunch of Farseers and Warlocks, I think. Children of the Open Skies give you a +1 inch move or +2 inches from fly, and advanced rolls always count as at least a 3. Looks fun for Howling Banshees in particular with their advance and charge. Diviners of Fate allow you to roll 1 extra dice for Strands of Fate, but still pick up the same amount. Elite Citizenry gives you +1 leadership and reroll 1 hit roll when a unit attacks. Hard to go too far wrong with a bit of extra damage output, particularly on high strength weapons like fire prisms maybe. Expert Crafters is the reroll 1 wound roll when a unit attacks. Still okay, but this basically got split up into 2 different traits, so it's a lot lower value. Grim is a bit underwhelming with +1 to combat attrition tests, and Hail of Doom gives you 6s to hit with shuriken cannons, counting as an unmodified wound roll of 6 as well. That's important as it's basically auto wounds plus extra AP as well. That actually doesn't seem too bad if you are thinking about using loads and loads of shurikens. Into the second half, and we have Headstrong for rerolling advances and charges. Not too bad if you are thinking about a melee build. Hunters of Ancient Relics allow you to shoot while doing actions. A bit weak on a whole army-wide ability, I think. Masterful Shots allows you to ignore light cover. Doesn't hurt to throw in on a very shooting-related army, but not quite the most meaningful if you're firing a whole load of high AP stuff around. Masters of Concealment give you light cover if you're greater than 12 inches away, basically part of the Elatok trait. Mobile Fighters give you +1 to wound if your units disembark from a transport this turn. Certainly looks nasty for a really solid alpha strike out of a Wave Serpent. Dire Avengers I think would like that quite a lot. Savage Blades gives you an extra AP -1 better in melee on the first round of combat. Striking Scorpions again I think would really like that. Going from AP -1 to 2 is quite a big deal. Swift Strikes allows you to counter stationary for shooting unless you fell back. I guess meaningful on anything that doesn't have battle focus, or things like Dark Reapers that need to move and shoot with heavy weapons. Students of Vor give you +1 saves for vehicles against damage 1 weapons, not really their biggest threat to be honest. Superior Shurikens give you +3 inch range to shuriken weapons. Doesn't hurt, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough to be meaningful enough of the time. Vengeful gives you 6s to hit in melee, generating extra hits. A really solid melee boost that one. Could combine quite nicely with that Children of Cain one actually for +1 damage. More hits means that you're going to be making more wound rolls for that. Warding Runes gives you a 6+ invul save and a 5+ feel no pain type save against mortal wounds, basically part of the Ulthway one. The invul save thing maybe isn't quite as meaningful with Eldar as other things, as quite a lot of things do tend to have invuls already. Webway Warriors allows a unit setting up as reinforcements to get exploding 6s to hit, and Wrath of the Dead allows Wraith Construct units to heroically intervene as if they were characters. Not the worst, but a bit of a shame to trade out a flat damage boost for that. Overall, it's really quite a massive and flexible trait of far-flung traits. Quite a few of those do look like some fun combos. There's multiple interesting ones for making some fairly stacked melee builds, which none of the main Craftworlds really seem to offer. I think the Children of Prophecy Psychic boost seems like a really nice one, more justifiable on Eldar where they really might be spamming Psykers, and plenty of the other ones seem okay. The reroll wounds thing is never going to hurt too much, and you could always just amp up some solid range damage with that plus ignoring cover. Could be interesting for some builds that are really focusing on one particular tactic. Finally, for rules, before we get into Asuryani Datasheets though, there are 4 secondaries for the faction. These ones you can take if your entire army is Asuryani. You can also take them if you're an Ynnari army, and if you're using an allied Harlequins detachment via travelling players, then you can still use these even so, though the Harlequins won't be able to score the actual objectives. There are 4 of them here, the first one being Scry Future, which is a Warpcraft one. This one's a Warp Charge 4 action done by one Psyker each turn, and it can try and scry one on Scry objective. You get 3 victory points for each objective that's been scried by the end of the game, and the casting difficulty gets increased by 1 each time you cast. Seems like it could be easy enough to have something like a Warlock just jumping around on a jet bike trying to do multiple of these. Unless you're unlucky with your rolls, that should add up to a fairly reliable 9+ victory points by the end of the game. Wrath of Cain is a no mercy no respite one. This one's for killing things with Aspect Warriors. 1 victory point if you kill an enemy unit with a melee attack by an Aspect Warrior in the turn. 1 victory point if you kill one with a ranged attack, and an additional 2 victory points if you manage to achieve both. I believe that would add up to a 4 victory points per turn. Seems like it's solid enough if you're going very heavy on the Aspect Warriors, though I think it's going to be quite rare that you get the 4 victory points off. I think there's a lot of the time where they're just not going to be able to quite kill their target, even if they do kill a lot of them. I think if you've got loads of Aspect Warriors running around, it could quite easily add up to a fairly reliable 10 victory points or so though. Next up, Scout the Enemy is a Shadow Operations one. It allows units to do actions greater than 6 inches away from your own deployment zone. Only 1 unit can do the action each turn, and it normally starts at the end of your movement phase until your next command phase, unless you do it with rangers. In that case, it completes at the end of your turn. It'll make rangers so much better at doing it, as the enemy doesn't get the chance to just gun them down. In any case, you get 2 victory points if you do it normally, or 4 victory points if you manage to do the action within your opponent's deployment zone. Maybe it could be a fairly powerful one with a unit of rangers in strategic reserve. Even with that though, it does seem like it might be a fairly difficult one to max. Though again, if you've got the right units in place, it does look like it should reliably score you at least a fair few points. Finally, we have a Battlefield Supremacy one called the Hidden Path. For this one, you either choose a webway gate greater than 6 inches away from your deployment zone, or an objective marker that's also 6 inches away from your deployment zone or more. At the end of the command phase, you gain victory points equal to the battle round number if you're holding the objective, or if it's a webway gate, then by having an Asuryani model within 3 inches of it, and no enemies there. Sorry, it is scrolled at the end of your command phase, so it does mean that your opponent is usually going to have the opportunity to try and take it back off you, unless you manage to kill any units nearby. If you've got a webway gate, it could be really quite a useful one to deploy somewhere hard to take, could at least cause some consternation perhaps. Overall, as faction-specific secondaries go, I feel like this one's really quite a nice set. The Psychic Action one looks very doable with an army full of fast Psykers. Wrath of Cain maybe is a little bit hard unless you've got loads of aspects on the go. The Shadow Ops one looks like it's an easy one to score on, but not max, and the Hidden Path one could be really quite all or nothing, depending on whether or not your opponent can just keep on taking that objective away from you. Next up though, let's go on to the Asuryani Datasheets, and I thought we'd start out with the new units, the Corsairs and the Shroud Runners, and then go through the rest of the Codex section by section. The Corsairs, who are coming out in that new Kill Team box, they're split into 2 different units, Corsair Void Reavers and Corsair Void Scarred. The Void Reavers are a troops choice, with a slightly unusual rule that they can't fill any mandatory detachment slots unless their detachment is 100% Anhrathes units, the technical keyword for Corsairs. It means that they do get objectives secured, and if you want to field them as an entire Corsair detachment, the only HQ in which you can do so is Prince Iriel. In any case, these Corsairs can be taken between 5 or 10 models strong. They're 10 points per model. They have both the Anhrathes, Asuryani and Drukhari keywords, so it means that you can take them in both, and they won't break any big detachment-wide rules. They aren't core units though, and they don't get Craftworld attributes. Their stat line's fairly similar to things like Dire Avengers, a 4+ save and 2 attacks, and they've got a squad leader called a Felarg, giving him +1 attack leadership. That remains at 1 wound, unlike the Exarchs. War gear wise, they've got really quite a lot of fancy stuff. Their standard weapon is the Shuriken Rifle, a 24-inch rapid fire weapon with strength 4, AP- damage 1 and the Shuriken Rule. If you want to field a more melee build for the squad, then you can swap it for Aeldari Power Sword and Shuriken Pistol. Still a little bit of Shuriken Fire, but getting a whole load of strength 4, AP- damage 1 attacks. With all their weapons, they do have a fun Reavers of the Void special rule, where hit rolls of 6 also wound the enemy, and also counts an unmodified wound roll of 6 as well. Really quite handy on the damage dealing front when you are hitting with such a flurry of low strength attacks. Otherwise, for options, the Fellark can take a Neuro Disruptor, the Harlequin Pistol that's Strength 6, AP-3, Damage 1, and you get 1 mortal wound if you hit a non-vehicle with it. And you can take a Mist Shield for a 4+ invul save for a little bit more defense. The pistols may be a bit take or leave, the Mist Shield seems a little bit pricey perhaps. Then in 1/5 models, you can either take Corsair Blasters, which have the Drukhari profile at 10 points per model, or Corsair Shredders, likewise at Assault D6, Strength 6, AP-1 and Damage 1, and they're 5 points in excess. You can then take 1 heavy weapon per 10 models in the squad, either 10 points for a Shuriken Cannon, which has got a fun buffed profile at Strength 6, AP-1, Damage 2, though it is a heavy weapon, so you're going to be taking the penalty if you move and shoot. Finally, for really big fire, you can take a Wraith Cannon, 18 inches, Assault 1, Strength 10, AP-4, and Damage D3+3, with 6s generating you a mortal wound. Overall, the unit seems like a fairly fragile gun platform type unit. They put out some okay firepower, though I'm not really sure that they're going to outcompete things like Guardians, to be honest. They put out a fairly similar weight of fire, and have access to all the things like Craftworld buffs, and a whole bunch of other options. These guys aren't going to be affected by the vast majority of psychic powers either, which doesn't really help them out. The Void Reavers do have some Elite's Choice cousins as well, as I mentioned, the Corsair Void Guard. In general, they're kind of similar in terms of their basic war gear, but have a few other fun options and some interesting choices. They're up to 12 points a model, and for that they get a very slightly boosted stat line, getting 3 attacks. It seems to push them a fair bit more in favour of the Power Sword version of the unit. You can get quite a good flurry of Strength 4 AP-3 with these now. As well as the standard models, you can get 0 to 1 of each specialist as well, though the squad has to be 10 models or less in total. They get all the previous options of the Void Reavers, but they can mix and match rifles and power swords within the same squad should you want to. And then a few of the other quite fun kill team style options, 5 points for a Ranger long rifle, 10 points for a fusion pistol instead of a power sword, and 10 points for 1 model to take a Falchu. The fun piratical murder parrot, probably aimed if you want to take the shooting version of the unit, as it allows the squad to ignore cover. Then you've got 3 individual specialists, a Shade Runner for 18 points who hits on 2s with 4 attacks, hitting at Strength 3, AP-3, Damage 1, plus when he charges in he causes a mortal wound on a roll to 2 to 5, and a D3 mortal wound on the roll of a 6. There's then a Soul Weaver for 17 points, the first failed save each turn becomes damage 0 when that model's around. A small increase in durability there, it's not going to make the squad survivable as a whole though I think. And then finally 25 points for a Wayseeker, what amounts to a very cheap mini Farseer, and he can cast 1 spell from either the Fate or Fortune discipline. Theoretically could be a way of generating you command points via Fortune, if you had nowhere else better to do it I guess. The model can't perils, and it has a Witch Staff that wounds on 2+, AP-1 and damage D3. Overall it's an interesting little unit. Again, I'm not really sure that they're going to outcompete things like the other aspect warriors like Howling Banshees. I think maybe the way I'd want to go with these guys is building for the melee build, seeing as they've got the 3 attacks. I guess that will be 30 attacks out of an 120 point unit, plus maybe you could get a bit of psychic going as well as that. Maybe the composite rules could just about go together and be worth it. They do seem a little bit awkward though, kind of halfway to a dedicated melee unit without quite getting there in terms of damage output or defense. Still though, really quite a fun and involved datasheet. I'm sure that there'll be some people trying them out. Finally, the other new unit for the Codex are the Shroud Runner jet bikes. These are the Ranger fast attack choice. You get 3 to 6 jet bikes in the squad, 35 points per model, or between 5 or 10 power. Like the other jet bikes, they move 16 inches, and like the Rangers, they hit on 2s now. They have 3 wounds at toughness 4 and a 4+ save. They don't have the Ranger keywords, so are locked out of doing certain options available only to them, but they are core bikers, with the Outcast, Asuryani and Craftworlds keywords. Weapons-wise, they're armed with a Ranger long rifle, which has been buffed to AP-1 now, and they also have a scatter laser, a heavy weapon now, with 6 shots, strength 6, AP-0, damage 1. They do seem to put out a fairly reasonable amount of volume fire, and they won't take any penalties for moving and shooting as their bikes. Really though, the thing to sell them are their special rules. They get their battle focus for the move, shoot, move. I think with a few fairly powerful models, these guys will be able to make good use of that. Strands of Fate, Ride the Wind for the automatic 6-inch advances that basically any of the jet bikes get, and then a few really quite fun, unique special rules. Their Shroud Runner cloak allows them to get cover as if they were infantry, and also get +1 to save if they're benefiting from it. Theoretically, that's a 2+ save when they're in cover now, so really quite tough to shift comparatively. They've got a target acquisition rule, where you get to nominate 1 enemy unit within 12 inches of them, and the other outcast units get to ignore cover against them. Good for getting those long rifle shots to hit home, though they aren't the biggest damage output in the codex. And finally, Swift Scouts allows them to make a normal move before the game begins, ending up anywhere outside 9 inches of enemy models. With their crazy 16-inch move, this could mean that they could get to some very abnormal lines of sight on the enemy, or even if they wanted to do some nuisance charges turn 1, they won't do much damage, but could certainly even tie up an enemy gunline unit in the backfield. Overall, again, they seem fun. It does feel like you're paying a bit of a premium for the utility though. They're not going to be doing all that much damage output with the weapons they've got for those points. Moving on to the rest of the codex though, and we'll start out with the troops. As mentioned already, Dire Avengers have become elites, but the troops section has gained those Corsair Void Reavers, though you can't use them to fill mandatory detachment slots in most Craftworld armies. So troops wise, it's largely going to be Guardians or Rangers. The Guardians have had a whole bunch of different changes. They've gone up to 9 points per model from 8, but that has granted them some pretty decent stat line improvements, a boosted save to a 4+, Shuriken catapults that are nicely amped up, 18-inch range now and getting AP-1 plus that new Shuriken rule, and as quite a nice little fluffy boost, they get to reroll hit rolls of 1 with Shuriken weapons if they're on an objective and they're defending it. They can also take a weapon platform per every 10 models in the squad for 20 points. That has all the usual suspect of the Aeldari special weapons. We've already mentioned the Shuriken Cannon or Scatter Laser, but Bright Lances are mirroring the Drukhari damage D3 plus 3, that'll cost you an extra 10 points over the platform, and Star Cannons have received an extra pip of strength, they go to strength 7 and flat damage 2. Otherwise, gaining things like Battle Focus and Strands of Fate are certainly going to help them out. Overall, with a bit of extra durability and hitting power, I think they are looking stronger than before, even with the extra points. Storm Guardians have a fairly similar story. They're going up to 8 points from 7. Again, they get the boosted save and Shuriken pistol damage, and their Guardian combat weapons hit at AP-1 now, and they basically get 2 attacks per model. They're not really going to be doing all that much in terms of damage output, not against anything but the lightest infantry. For just surviving though, they've got the option of a Serpent Scale platform, a 20 points durability platform. It gives the squad a 5+ invul save, and it means that they can't be wounded on 1s or 2s versus ranged attacks. Sometimes that'll come in handy against anything with strength 6 or higher. They can also take a fusion gun, basically a melter gun for 10 points, an Aeldari Flamer or a power sword for 5 points each. They also get the fun special rule in Stormblades, re-rolling hit rolls of 1 versus enemies on objectives, though still it doesn't make their damage output good. Having a higher minimum squad size I don't think has really helped these out though so much. It does mean that you have to make really quite a big commitment to the squad. Finally we come to Rangers at 13 points per model. I feel like these guys are going to probably see the most play in troops, certainly not for their damage output, but just because they're really quite good utility, and they're the cheapest of the troops if you just want them to have them sit around on objectives. Damage wise, they have seen improvements. Their ballistic skill goes to 2+, and the AP-1 on their rifles. They've had their deep strike rule replaced by a forward deployment rule, so they basically get scout style deployment anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy or their units. And as mentioned in that stratagem section, they get that Resonator Shard ability as well, the one that can allow them to spot for artillery, re-rolling all hit rolls. Finally, for every 5 models in the unit, you can take one of these 2 upgrades. For 5 points, the Gloomfield makes them a bit more defensible at range, giving them dense cover at greater than 18 inches, and the Wireweave Net makes them a bit more of a tricky prospect to charge. When you activate it, when the enemy charges you, on a 2+, it causes D3 mortal wounds to them, and gives them a -2 to their charge roll. That's pretty much paid for itself then and there, as soon as the enemy declares a charge. As I said, out of the troops, I do feel that the Rangers are probably going to get used the most. Nice screening, and a few utility rules. I treat the sniping damage as a small bonus. Next up, I thought we'd go through the Aspect Warriors. They've all seen some relatively similar changes. Basically every single one of them have got +1 attack. They've all picked up a 5+ invul. They can take those Exarch Power options that we mentioned earlier, and all of the standard ones besides Crimson Hunters are core units. Most of them have also gone up in points a bit as well, but generally being rewarded by better abilities. First up, the Dire Avengers are 12 points up from 11. They are now elites, not troops, which does take the shine off them a bit. Their Shuriken weapons are 18-inch range now though, and their Assault 3, Strength 4 and AP-2. They do feel like they're a bit more of a premier infantry clearing unit now. 30 attacks at that profile coming out of a big 10-man squad does look fairly intimidating, but they're still not going to be super overwhelming, even against elite infantry. It's generally good news for their Exarchs though. Their war gear is largely free. The Power Glaive at Strength +2, AP-2, Damage 2 would make them fairly decent in melee whatever they do, or you can swap that out for a Dire Sword or an additional Shuriken Catapult for yet more firepower. The only upgrade that costs 5 points is the Shimmer Shield, which gives the Exarch personally a 4+ invul save. They do have that stratagem for shooting twice if their squad gets depleted, which could be fun, and just innately they're allowed to do actions while they're shooting, so quite nice that they don't have any conflicting priorities. It could be a reasonable unit to put in strategic reserve to come into the edges of the board, do some actions, and hoover up some enemies at the same time. The Fire Dragons are up to 23 points a model, really quite a big increase up from 18. They get the normal Aspect Warrior changes, but to be honest, the scary thing about them is their enormously powerful fusion gun. This one's now Melter Gun on steroids. Not only is it strength 9, but it gets a big damage d6+2 all the time, regardless of whether or not you're in half range. These guys are basically death incarnate to hard targets. Most toughness 8 or 7 vehicles will melt to a single volley of these if you roll average with a unit of 5, and that's not even accounting for the reroll wound rolls of 1 that they get against vehicles and monsters. The Exarch can take their Dragon's Breath Flamer, a 12-inch strength 6 AP-1 damage 1 flamer, that costs no extra, though could be a downgrade against hard targets, or can upgrade to a Fire Pike with boosted range, and they get a big damage d6+4, as if d6+2 weren't enough. To be honest though, I'm not sure that they're all that amazing, not compared with just getting more Fire Dragons in the unit. Next up we have Howling Banshees at 18 points per model, up from 15, and these girls have been given a bunch of helpful special rules on top of the many that they already had. They now have 3 attacks, and strike at strength 4, AP-4 with those Banshee blades, so already really quite a lot more threatening on their base profile. They've just got a crazy stacked amount of special rules though, which make them into a premier combat unit. The enemy can't overwatch or set to defend against them. Enemy units that charge now fight last due to their Banshee masks. They're now at permanent -1 to hit both at range and in melee, so they're a tiny bit more survivable than they really should be for their stat line. They still retain being able to advance and charge, and now they also get +1 to wound on the charge as well. Basically they're hitting with a ton of really high AP attacks. They've got tougher, fightier, and just really counter quite a lot of the downsides that fragile melee units often come up against. The Exarch can take Mirror Swords for free, which is pretty crazy, as they're basically a profile of a Banshee blade with only AP-3, but you get double attacks, or you can trade it for a Triskel, which gives you a small shooting attack, 3 shots at strength 5, AP-3, damage 1, or pay 5 points for an Executioner, strength 5, AP-3, and damage 2. The Banshee Exarch Powers seemed really nice as well. A 4+ invul save for the unit or extra damage on the Exarch attacks both seem great. With their speed and how hard they can hit, I do feel that they could be an interesting unit to build around, bursting from cover to take something down, maybe helped out with Guide and Doom. They do have stiff competition for being the melee aspect though, as Striking Scorpions are also massively better. They're 17 points up from 13, so again a major increase, but they also get 3 attacks at base and a 5+ invul, and might be a tiny bit more durable than Banshees sometimes with a 3+ armor save. Their chainswords are strength +2, so strength 5, AP-1 now, and their Mandiblasters do mortal wounds to non-vehicles on wound rolls of 6. It means that with a big squad you're likely to get at least a good 5 or 6 mortal wounds on the basic attacks alone. Never mind what the actual chainswords do, and they also get 6s to hit exploding. They generate extra attacks from their sustained assault, though those attacks can't generate Mandiblaster hits for some reason. Like the Rangers, they also get 4 deployments setting up on the midfield, so they could be potentially getting some ludicrously dangerous first turn charges, particularly as I believe that you could pull them back with Phantasm if the opponent does get lucky and gets first turn. Finally, the Exarch gets a Scorpion's Claw for 10 points if he wants. It's now damage 2 and has a slightly better Shuriken profile. Or maybe I do feel that the Biting Blade might be a tiny bit more points efficient. It's only strength +2, AP-2, damage 2, but gets +2 attacks and only costs 5 points. Particularly in combination with that Mortal Wounds on 5's power, these guys could just go through virtually anything with the amount of mortal wounds they throw out. Crazily dangerous for a potential first turn charge threat. Moving into the fast attack aspects now, and Shining Spears remain at 35 points, so no changes there. They've got 3 attacks on their base profile, a 5+ invul save in range and melee now, though their squad size has been diminished a bit, only 3 to 6 models, so buffs and psychic don't go quite as far. Maybe their biggest trade-off is that they've lost their 4+ invul save against ranged attacks, which really did quite help keep them safe. They trade that for a -1 to hit against them, which is still handy but not quite as reliable. In general though, they do hit a fair bit harder, +1 attack is great. Their laser lances get +1 strength if they're not charging now, which they didn't used to, and the Shuriken catapults are a fair bit more dangerous. Shining Spears always are deceptively shooty with the amount of Shuriken shots and laser lance close range fire that they can kick out. The Exarch Star Lance costs 10 points, The Paragon Saver is free and now also gives you +1 strength and +1 attack now, as well as reroll all hits and wounds, so that one does actually have some fairly decent comparable damage outputs to Star Lances now against quite a lot of targets. You can take a Shuriken Cannon on the Exarch for free, and the Exarch can also take a Shimmer Shield for 5 points for a 4+ invul. They still seem very fragile for the points cost to be honest, but they hit spectacularly hard. Throw Guide on them, and I feel like almost any number of them is likely to earn their points back quite quickly if they do get a decent turn of both ranged and melee damage. The Swooping Hawks have gone up to 18 points per model for 16 now. Their damage output is kind of still so-so, but they're a pretty weird unit now that doesn't really function very similar to anything else in 40k. Their Las Blasters have gained strength 4 and auto wound things on 6s to hit. Not going to be much use against anything with a decent armor save or loads of wounds, but they'll clear out chaff infantry pretty nicely. The thing that makes them pretty crazy though, is that instead of getting battle focus, they basically get to jump to anywhere on the board that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy. It's basically the ultimate move shoot move. You get to cause your damage output, and then put yourself about as safe as you could possibly be on the board, knowing that you're almost always going to be in threat range of the enemy with that massive 14-inch movement. Unless the enemy gets some really good movement off, they're going to be a thorn in the enemy's side all game long, putting out a fair bit of volume fire, maybe sacrificing themselves or doing something annoying like a nuisance charge if it makes sense to. Finally, their Hawk's Talon is 10 points more. That's a strength 5 AP-1 Las Blaster essentially, and the Exarch can also take a Power Sword as well for 5 points. They seem like a really tricky little unit, not very good for the damage output, but just for bounding around the board and getting almost guaranteed damage every single turn, it doesn't seem too terrible. Maybe 1 or 2 units to act as utility units and help out with secondaries and things. Lastly, for the fast attack choices, we have the Warp Spiders, up to 20 points from 18. Their jumpy around moves have changed quite a bit. They now have a permanent 12-inch movement that can move straight through enemy models and terrain, very similar to the Grey Knight Interceptors and things. And then, perhaps not too dissimilar from their previous versions of rules, they can move 2d6 inches after shooting with battle focus, though if they roll a double 1 for this, one of them gets lost in the warp, and the squad takes a mortal wound. The Death Spinner is some fairly impressive firepower as well, at 12 inches, assault d6 shots, strength 6, AP-2, damage 1. It does have the blast keyword, but it does not auto-hit. That version of the Death Spinner must have been from an older version of the rules. Finally, if they weren't annoying enough already to get to grips with, they can also jump when they're charged as well. The first time that they're charged each turn, they get to move a normal move 6 inches, though they can't overwatch at the same time as doing this. Otherwise, they get to deep strike for free, and the Exarch has the option to take some power blades for a bit of close combat threat, and an extra Death Spinner thrown in. That all costs 10 points. I think Warp Spiders are looking like one of the bigger winners of the Aeldari Codex. 3 or 4 strength 6 AP2 shots seems great for 20 points, particularly when they're this mobile. Finally, at least for the squads of Aspect Warriors, we have the Dark Reapers. They work a bit differently to the rest, only being available in 5 model units now for 150 points. Technically, this means that they have got a small points cut, as they were 32 points per model before, but I think being locked to just 5 models is kind of unhelpful. A lot of people like to field them either in multiple small units of 3 with Tempest launchers, or up to big units of 10 for maximum buffs. To be fair to them, they were one of the aspects that worked quite well already. Their Reaper launches are completely unchanged with their single shot at strength 8 or 2 shots at strength 5. And if you're wanting core infantry that deal damage at long range, these basically are the choice for the Eldar Codex. I think maybe with all the good stuff that core infantry can achieve, they perhaps felt the need to rein the Reapers in a bit. They generally move slow and purposefully, so they don't get battle focus, though it certainly seems they could still fire and fade, and their Ignores Modifiers rule has been toned down considerably. They now only ignore dense cover at range, so they don't ignore the penalty for moving and shooting heavy weapons, for example. Quite a blow this. There's a lot that doesn't apply to, anything on datasheets that gives them -1 to hit, or say targeting aircraft and things. For the Exarch, basically all the profiles have stayed very similar, but they do cost a fair bit cheaper than they did before. The Shuriken Cannon is maybe a little bit more tempting at its buff profile, and the Tempest Launcher is only +10 points now rather than +20 as it was before. Overall, out of any of the aspects, I think it's maybe the least positive news for the Dark Reapers, but still with the amount of buffs for core infantry, it might still be enough to have them shine through. If you want a squad that deals hefty damage to hard targets at range, they're still going to be one of the stronger choices. Finally, for aspects, we do have the Crimson Hunters. I'll cover them with the Flyers. Next up though, I thought we'd talk through the various flavour of Wraith units. Wraith constructs have essentially all gained -1 damage, making them really quite a lot harder to take out, while still being roughly the same points as they were before. In normal circumstances, they get Strands of Fate but not battle focus. so it means that they could still punch in some damage results and things, but in general they're not going to be moving around unless they're, say, Wraithguard next to a Spirit Seer. Keywords wise, the Wraithguard, Wraithblades and Wraithlord all do gain core. Quite interesting for the Wraithlord, seeing as it's one of the biggest fightiest core things around, kind of mirroring the Space Marine Dreadnoughts I guess, and again with just so many wounds and quite hefty damage profiles, I think they're still going to be popular choices for psychic spells and things. Layer some durability buffs on some Wraithblades with shields, and I think they're going to be very hard to shift. One other surprise inclusion as well that again I've mentioned with flyers is the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. This thing has actually got the Spirit Host and Wraith Construct keywords now. I'm not sure if it did before, but rather surprisingly it has picked up the -1 damage as well, so now it's perhaps surprisingly sturdy for a very fragile looking Eldar plane. In any case, in terms of the main Wraith units, Wraithguard are 40 points, up from either 33 to 43. -1 damage is really going to help them, it's going to get them to shrug off things like 2 or 3 damage weapons so much better than before, and now both they and the Wraithblades have 3 attacks each now, though the Wraithguard did lose their Wraithguard Fists rule, so they're basically just striking at strength 5 with no AP now. The Wraith Cannon's got longer range at 18 inches, and as Assault 1, strength 10, AP -4, damage D3+3. Like the rest of the Distort weapons, it gets a mortal wound when it rolls a 6 to wound, and the D-side is still the more expensive option, 5 points for a 12-inch shot, Assault D6 at strength 10, AP -4 and damage 1, a blast attack that doesn't auto-hit and causes mortal wounds on 6s. You certainly pay a premium cost, but that's going to lay some hurt on literally anything that it fires at. Finally, they've lost the fall back and shoot rule, but they can now shoot an engagement range with those guns, so perhaps opponents need to be a little bit wary about tagging them, otherwise they might just get blown away by all this Distort weaponry. I have a feeling that out of the two, I think that Wraithblades might get more people attracted to them, but there's certainly no doubt that Wraithguard do hit pretty hard for the cost now. That's some pretty serious firepower going on. Wraithblades are 40 points, up from 35. Again they gain the attack, but no longer get one on the charge anymore, so they're just 3 attacks all the time. The Ghost Axe and Force Shield still remain 5 points more than the Ghost Swords. The Ghost Axe has lost its -1 to hit penalty though, so another decent damage boost there. The Swords have also seen a small buff, going up to 5 attacks per model now, as they're +2 attacks, not 1. I still have a feeling though that people might want the Axe and Shield ones, as getting a 4+ invul save on top of -1 damage is just going to make them spectacularly durable. Layering that with something like Protect and Fortune as well could give you a seriously good squad for holding down objectives. For the bigger Wraith constructs, the Wraithlord remains 100 points base, and as one of the bigger and shootier core units in the book, I feel like it's going to be quite popular. Its weapons can be affected by things like Doom, which I think is going to be quite nice. It's fairly well good news across the board for the Wraithlord. -1 damage is great on big multi-wound models. It's lost 1 wound to 9 wounds, but this is kind of a blessing in disguise, as it means that it doesn't degrade anymore. The Shuriken catapults hit a fair bit harder than they did with their longer range and AP. It can still swap them out for flamers for 5 points each, and it can pack up to 2 heavy weapons of your choosing, 5 points for scatter lasers, 10 points for shuriken cannons, 15 for star cannons or missile launchers, or 20 for lances. All of those certainly have decently boosted profiles compared with before. Finally, the Ghost Glaive is looking really quite good fun, strength +2, AP -4, and a big damage D3+3, and then it can swap that out for double the attacks, usually up to 8, for strength 7, AP -2, and damage 2. Really quite a good generalist profile there already. I feel like Wraithlords have gone from something that's fairly underwhelming to really quite potent. I could easily see a few of them stomping up the board supported by a Spirit Seer for those reroll wounds, a psychic buff of some sort, and allowing that boosted stratagem for healing for them for 3 wounds per turn. For the biggest Wraith thing of the lot, there is the Wraith Knight, of course, 400 points, up from 315, though it has gained a fair bit for its trouble. The durability might well be worth it all by itself. It has lost 2 wounds to 22, but it's gained a 5+ invul at base and -1 damage. Against quite a lot of high AP guns, that's going to be an effective doubling of durability just between those 2 rules. In combat, its attacks have gone from 4 to 5, though in general it is still a nerf to the thing in combat unless you're taking the Ghost Glaive, as the feat can now only generate 1 attack each rather than 3. The Ghost Glaive and Scatter Shield is the default loadout. Scatter Shield gives you a 4+ invul, and the Ghost Glaive gives you strength 14 and damage 6 attacks, or can be used to make the sweep attack at strength 8, AP -3, damage 2, and 15 attacks there. Maybe not bad, but then you are making the construct almost entirely melee focused. Otherwise, the other weapons do seem to have become a bit more flexible. You can trade out the Ghost Glaive for the Sun Cannon for an extra 50 points. That's become a far more generalist heavy threat now, 48 inches, 2d6 shots, strength 8, AP -3, damage 3. Really quite powerful shooting, though you are giving up a ton of melee for that. The heavy Wraith Cannons it looks like you can now take independently. They're 30 points each to replace each arm, heavy D3 shots at strength 16, AP -4, damage D3 plus 6, and D3 mortal wounds on wound rolls of 6s. Seem like they could be a particularly good target for punching in those 6s to wound from Strands of Fate. Finally, as well as all this, it gets Knight style rules. You can fall back and charge, and move across most units when you're moving. I feel that on balance, maybe the Wraith Knight doesn't quite have enough to make it super competitive. It certainly doesn't seem quite as efficient as that Tau Storm Surge to me. But even with the points increase, it does look like it's a decent step in the right direction, massively more durable and more dangerous at range and in melee. Next up, let's start talking about bikes and vehicles. We have already mentioned the Shroud Runners and Shining Spears in previous sections. Windrider jet bikes remain 20 points per model at base. They get their Shuriken catapults boosted by 18-inch range and AP -1, and kind of interestingly have got a 3+ save from a 4+. They're now basically as tough as a Space Marine Intercessor. I guess that's mirroring the armor save changes from the troops. For their points cost, they do seem really quite efficient just in their base loadout, but you can trade them out for a Scatter Laser for 5 points, or a Shuriken Cannon for +10. The cannon does feel like you're paying really quite a big premium over those catapults though. It's to be between the catapults or the Scatter Laser for me. They both have the Guardians and Core keywords, and they have a Swift Demise rule, which means that when they're shooting at enemies on objectives, they get to reroll hit rolls of 1. Seem like really quite solid for the pure stats and for a utility unit. Just being able to move as fast as they can with battle focus looks like they could be really quite annoying, and pretty great for bullying enemy infantry off objectives. Next up we have the bigger brothers in the Vipers, 40 points base from 50 now. Their profile is fairly similar, but that's going to be a lot more efficient with the heavy weapon buffs. As with the other heavy weapons, the Scatter Laser is the cheapest and the base loadout for the main gun, Shuriken Cannons being a 5-point upgrade, and the Aeldari Missile Launcher or Star Cannon +10, and the Lance +15. It's quite similar for a fair few of the Eldar heavies. Otherwise, not really too much to say besides being a fast-moving gun platform. They gained an attack to 2 attacks base. They no longer get the small move boost for fielding 3 models at once, but they now do gain a big 6 inches if they advance. I guess that could be worse if you absolutely need the mobility and just want to rely on Shuriken catapult fire. They, like the War Walkers, do not get Core or the Guardian keyword, but as fast-moving gun platforms, I guess you could do worse. They do seem pretty cheap and efficient for the firepower with Shurikens and a Scatter Laser, or they could be an interesting platform to mount some bright lances on for some fast-moving, hard-hitting anti-tank. Moving to the heavy support and War Walkers at 55 points base, down from 60. Again, like a few other things, they've gained +1 attack to 3. In general, it's fairly good news for them. Their heavy weapons have got the same buffs, they cost the same amount of points as the Viper, and their 4+ save has been buffed to a 3+, they still get the 5+ invul. Kind of interestingly as well, they get Scout style deployment as well. They're no longer able to outflank the enemy for free, but setting up front and centre could mean that they could unleash some really hefty firepower turn 1, or I believe that they'd still be able to be redeployed with Phantasm, so they could flexibly be either a very powerful ranged alpha strike, or sit back in your deployment zone and stay safe. Again, they're not core. I was wondering whether or not they might pick that up. I feel like if they were quite efficient firepower units, then they'd be really quite spammed a lot if they were core, I guess. Going through the rest of the heavy support section, support weapons are now 45 points each, down from 50. Again, they're not core, but they do have the Guardians keyword, which is pretty handy for certain options. Say for example getting +1 to hit with the Ulthwig Black Guardian stratagem. They're not going to run away, their leadership has gone up to 10 from 7, and each of the profiles of their guns have changed a little bit, as have their points costs. Shadow Weavers are now the cheapest at 45 points down from 55, 48 inches, D6 shots, and they've gained strength 6 AP -2 now, with no extra AP on 6s. They seem fairly cheap and efficient for a bit of ignores line of sight barrage shooting, could certainly clear a bit of infantry. The D cannon is looking very fearsome indeed, 65 points now down from 75, and remains a short range barrage weapon, heavy D3, a big strength 12 AP -4, and now the fearsome damage D6 +2. The short range does mean that they're a bit more of an area denial thing rather than something you can guarantee is going to be in range, but that's just some ridiculously efficient shooting right there, even more so on a unit that your opponent might well not be able to target if it's hiding away. I feel like a couple of D cannons in a list are going to be pretty popular. Finally, the Vibro cannon has gone up a little bit, up to 55 from 50, and at base they're a 48-inch heavy D6 auto cannon kind of profile with strength 7 AP -1 and damage 2. Their linked fire kind of rule now only affects their own unit, it doesn't affect any other units, but basically if you have 2 Vibro cannons in the same battery they auto hit, and if you have 3 cannons they both auto hit and get +1 to wound. Certainly not too bad as a general purpose threat. They'll just come a bit unstuck whenever they get -1 damage. Overall though, it looks cheap and efficient. I'd say maybe the D-Cannons and the Shadow Weavers are the more exciting ones now. Next up we have the Falcon, which really does seem to have changed in purpose quite a lot, and it's gone up to 140 points from 115. Its Pulse Laser is far more threatening, Strength 9, AP -3 and Damage D3 +3, and it also gets the heavy weapon buffs and Shuriken Catapult ones. What's making the Falcon look really scary though is its Cloud Strike special rule, which kind of means that it functions a bit like a Space Marine drop pod, albeit one with a massive ton of guns. It can basically be put in Deep Strike Reserve for free, and it can Deep Strike on turn 1, despite that not usually being a mission special rule that you're allowed. Then when it has Deep Strike on turn 1, the unit within can then disembark, so if you're willing to play a little bit risky, it seems like it could be one of the best ways to deliver things like Fire Dragons to the fray. It does only have a fairly small transport capacity of 6. To be honest though, even if it wasn't carrying anything, it still seems to be pretty scary at that profile. Lots of guns that you can just pop up automatically turn 1, and hopefully get great line of sight on the enemy. The vehicle upgrades are the same for the other various grav tanks. Vectored engines are interesting as a one-use battle focus. Crystal targeting matrices allow you to ignore hit roll modifiers. Spirit stones double the wounds remaining for the vehicle damage profile, and star engines give you 3-inch extra move. Out of those, the vectored engines and the crystal targeting matrix are probably my favourites. Move, shoot and hide even for one turn is pretty powerful, and ignoring modifiers is going to help out against a lot of targets, particularly anything in dense cover. Still though, between these gun profiles and also delivering an Auspex squad into the fray, I think that Falcons are going to be really quite popular. Their damage dealing threat is pretty huge. Otherwise for the grav tanks, we have the Night Spinner for 140 points now, up 5 points, but the Doomweaver gained AP -2. Really quite decent general purpose artillery, and they have that Resonator Shard stratagem with the Rangers. Again, looks like it's going to remain quite popular I think with that profile. The Fire Prism's 160 points, up from 155. It's maybe had a bit of a side grade. It has lost its double shoot rule for just boosted profiles on the main weapons. That does mean it's more mobile, no longer has to move at half distance, but it now only has 2 profiles, not 3. It's not going to be quite as good against 1 wound infantry. The Pulse mode seems quite good at killing Space Marines, and the Lance mode really good for smashing heavies. 2 shots at strength 14, AP -3 and damage 3d3. As we mentioned, it has that linked fire one for ignoring some invuls if it combines fire with another prism. Finally for transports we have the Wave Serpent, 140 points base, down from 150, and it gains similar heavy weapon profiles at the similar sort of cost to the Vipers. The Serpent Shield now gives you a 5+ invul save and transhuman physiology, can't be wounded on 1 to 3, and this is basically replacing the -1 damage mechanic, which now seems to be going to the Wraith units. Still though, it looks like a hardy transport with some decent firepower and very fast indeed. I feel that people might be very tempted by Falcons though for the same points cost and that scary deep strike ability. As mentioned in the stratagem section, discharging the shield is now a 1 CP stratagem and it cancels some overwatch. Flyers next then, and the Mighty Crimson Hunters 170 to 190 points. Previously they were 180, they cost 190 if you take Bright Lances, as they're 10 points extra each. The Exarch option now only comes from that Exarch table that we had before, that makes them hits on 2s and have an extra wound, and it's 20 to 30 points in price. The standard Crimson Hunter's ballistic skill has dropped to 3+ though, but I think that has been more than outweighed by the damage output on the big anti-tank guns. Both the Pulse Lasers and the Bright Lancers are now D3+3 damage, and they'll still be smashing anything straight out of the sky, as Sky Hunter is now +1 to hit against fly, and you get to reroll wound rolls against them. Basically the majority of the time you're going to be hitting and wounding with all 4 of those massive shots. A bit sadly for the Eldar flyers, they no longer get their second pivot after moving. Wings of Cain just seems to be completely gone, they're going to be operating as more normal flyers now. The Hemlock Wraith Fighter has seen more changes though, it's 210 points down from 220, and as I mentioned technically counts as a Wraith construct now with the Spirit Host keyword, which does allow a few options and synergy. Heavy D size are a similar kind of profile to the standard ones, they gain 6-inch range, 2 pips of strength and damage 2 rather than 1. They look pretty hefty for clearing out elite infantry and anything without damage -1. It retains its -2 leadership aura, now called a Mind Shock pod. The Wraithbone form makes it a bit more durable with -1 damage, though that does come in at the expense of the 6+ Feel No Pain. Spirit Stones now work how they do for the other Aeldari vehicles. This thing only degrades when it gets to 3 wounds now, so it's going to be very accurate all the way through. As before, it still casts a psychic power with the debuff effect from the Runes of Battle, and it also lost its second pivot from Wings of Cain. Overall though, I think this thing is coming out ahead, mainly because of how much harder those heavy D salves hit. The rest is a bit of a balance of positives and negatives. While we're on vehicles and big units, I'll just mention the Webway Gate as well. 80 points down from 95. It now sets up further than 12 inches away from the enemy, can't be destroyed and counts as an obstacle. Still might struggle to set up with that main rulebook rule of setting up greater than 3 inches from enemy terrain, and grants Inspiring to Aeldari. It really helps out with reserves in a couple of different ways. Halving the CP cost to put Aeldari in strategic reserve, and they can emerge from between 6 inches of both arches, regardless of how close the enemy are, so it means that you can put some very threatening units very close to the enemy, if they are being a bit bold. For 80 points I think is a bit more interesting, particularly as it has some interaction with that secondary. Finally, let's jump back to the HQ section then, and go through the various Craftworld characters. The Avatar of Cain is 270 points, up from 200, and he's now an absolute beast in melee, 10-inch movement, strength 7, toughness 8, 14 wounds, 7 attacks, leadership 10 and a 2+ save, backed up by a 4+ invul and halving any incoming damage. The Wailing Doom hits as hard as you might expect, strength 14, AP -5 and damage d6 +2, or trading it out for strength user sweep attacks at AP -2 and damage 2. He can also shoot the Wailing Doom as a beam attack at strength 12, AP -4 and damage d6 +2. If there's multiple enemy units in a line, it could theoretically skew a multiple. It can't take Warlord traits and relics. It does get Battle Focus and Strands of Fate, and also provides a couple of helpful buffs, core units within 12 inches ignoring combat attrition modifiers, and when they're less than 6 inches they can re-roll charges. Overall, it really doesn't seem too bad as a central piece to do some heavy lifting. If you throw this towards an objective, the opponent's going to have to deal with it in some fashion, and with that really meaty defensive profile, it's going to be hard to take down for the vast majority of armies. It maybe is just a bit liable to being screened by cheap enemy chaff though. Being a monster, it can't move through terrain quite as easily as other things. For the Autarchs, the standard one remains 80 points base, gain +1 attack to 5, and gaining battle focus with its guns could be pretty helpful. You could maybe move and get other units in range of that aura. Autarchs picked up a fun rule that allowed them to use 2 command point rerolls per phase if you want to. So say you could reroll 2 different saves for a key character or unit, and maybe have them survive to strike back in combat. He doesn't get that command point farming ability though, that one's gone to a Warlord trait. It did gain a whole ton of options from that new kit, though despite the 2 kits being compatible, Games Workshop has separated out the war gear options. You can't mix and match the 2, which kind of weirdly means that you can't build the Aeldari Autarch on the front cover of the book. In any case, the old kit loadout, the one with the Manda Blasters, Banshee Blade, Swooping Hawk Wings and Fusion Pistol, that one's 25 points, and the new kit option has a lot more flexibility. You can pick up a Reaper launcher for 15 points, a Death Spinner for 10, or a Dragon Fusion Gun for 15. Maybe the single best value one is the Banshee Mask for +5 points, ignoring Overwatch and Fighting Last for the opponent. It only gets that if you charge though, and the Warp Jump generator for 20 points, giving it Warp Spider-like movements. Looks fun, the rerolls could be handy, though it might be in stiff competition with other things like the Seers and things like the Phoenix Lords. The Autarch Skyrunner is 100 points down from 105. Again it gained +1 attack to 5, which will certainly help out the Laser Lance, and for all the jet bites, getting better shurikens is no bad thing. Seers next, and the Farseer is 90 points down from 115, so really quite a generous points decrease here, though I think that one does go hand in hand in losing the rerolls innately for Cast and Deny. That rune to the Farseer now allows them to manipulate 1 Strands of Fate dice, and each Seer allows you to reroll 1 of those dice every time you roll them. It does certainly mean that they're a fair bit less reliable at casting though. We've already gone over their psychic changes. Some spells have got better, some are a bit worse and only locked to core, and they can always potentially throw down an Eldritch Storm as well if you've got some CP to spare. Witchblades and Singing Spears have changed slightly. They're still strength user, with Witchblades gaining AP -1 and damage 2, and Singing Spears are AP 0 still, but a flat damage of 3. Again, they generally wound on 2s, or the Singing Spear strength 9 when thrown at range. Finally, the Ghost Helm now always allows you to ignore perils, so it removes a bit of randomness there. Overall, I don't really think it's the worst for Farseers. Their rerolls going away does make them worse, but that has been accompanied by a fairly hefty points cut as well of 25 points. I still think they're probably going to be one of the most popular HQs for the army. They do also get the Farseer Skyrunner as well, down to 120 points from 135. Their better shuriken catapults and battle focus will probably help them a bit. Finally, for special character Farseers, Eldrad Ulthuan is 145 points now, down from 155, and he's still ridiculously good at casting spells, getting 3 powers at re-rolling all psychic tests, plus Ulthway's +1 to cast. He loses his 3+ invul save for a 4+ invul and an only wounded on 4+ rule, and the Staff of Ulthramar now also wounded on a 2+ in addition to its previous profile. I think if you are playing Ulthwe, he'd be a very tempting pickup, basically guaranteeing that your 3 most important powers are going to get cast. For the Lesser Seers, the Spirit Seer is 70 points, up from 60. They now can either cast a spell from the Runes of Fortune or the Runes of Battle. Both of those are decent, whether it's farming command points, protecting units, or whatever else. Basically, you'd want to take them if you're going to be using the Spirit Mark ability, allowing core Wraith units within 6 inches to reroll wound rolls of 1. Much more useful than the previous version of that rule, the one where you had to be 6 inches of the unit that they were attacking. Seems like it'd be great support for a few Wraith Knights or a big blob of Wraith Guard perhaps. Warlocks and their Warlock Skyrunner brothers have been moved to elites. Now the Conclave and the single model are basically represented by the same datasheet. A single one on its own costs 40 points and it gains the character keyword, pretty good for not being directly shot. Otherwise, if you have between 2 and 6 of them, they're 20 points per model. Quite a smart way of balancing the character keyword against taking more models, to be honest. If you have 4 or more models for 80 points in the unit, they get to cast 2 spells each turn, which is quite nice. And you can take a Warlock Conclave slot free if you do happen to have a Farseer in the detachment. As before, their powers have been updated, and they do get access to full-blown Spite now, not just the mini Destructor power that they had before. Still seem really great value for their points, really fragile and not going to do much in combat, but I think it's going to be quite rare that an Eldar list isn't going to be able to make good use of several of their powers. Warlock Skyrunners are also an elite slot. These guys are only 1 to 3 models in size, 60 points per one, or 35 points each for 2 or 3 of them. These guys get 2 powers if there's 3 models in the unit, and are broadly getting similar changes to the previous. Obviously they just get those powers cast with a massive amount more movement. A Warlock Skyrunner still looks like it could be a good option for winging around the board doing that psychic action. For the non-Phoenix Lord special characters, Prince Iriel is 90 points, up from 85. He has the Iandin and Anhrathes keywords, and his reroll 1s work for both of them. He gets +1 attack, and his Spear of Twilight is now strength ×2, AP -3, damage 3. Sorry, the strength ×3 there was a typo. It does no longer wound on 2s though the extra damage will help out. The Eye of Wrath can now be fired multiple times per game, but it is quite close range, and Assault 1, strength 6, AP -3, damage 2. And he's got a fun special rule that halves the amount of command points that Strategic Reserves cost for infantry and Anhrathes units in the detachment. He gets the Autarch CP rule, and if you want to field an entire detachment of Corsair units, then he's basically the way to do so. Illic Knight Spear is the Elatorch Ranger character. His sniper rifle is Voidbringer, heavy 1 at strength 6, AP -3 and damage 3, and wound rolls of a 4+ deal D3 mortal wounds. Seems like he could be a very good choice for punching in an automatic 6 with the wound roll for Strands of Fate. Again, he gets Scout style deployment and has the Outcast and Ranger keywords, so he does have some synergies there. And when he's in cover, he can't be targeted by enemy guns outside 12 inches away. Finally, for Asuryani characters, we have the Phoenix Lords. For the ridiculously OP warriors that they're supposed to be, they had some very underwhelming rules before, but Games Workshop has just given them big layers of buffs here. Just at base, all of them now get a 4+ invul save. They can't take more than 3 wounds per phase, so it's going to take 2 phases to bring them down at least. They still can't get relics and warlord traits. They have that stratagem to allow them to resurrect on death for 1 CP on a 4+. Each of them grant an aura of +2 leadership and objectives secured to their aspect warriors within 6 inches, but they don't give them any damage boosts. I think objective secured is really quite powerful though, particularly for the ones that want to be venturing forwards. Finally, as if that weren't enough though, they all gain 6 attacks on their base profile. Most of them tended to have 4 before. So casually dumping a truckload of buffs on these mighty warriors. A lot of them have gone up in points a bit, but also gained other special abilities and damage rules. First up, the new Morgan Ra model remains 150 points. He gains +2 attacks to 6 attacks, +1 move to 7 inches, and the Harvester of Souls is a lot more brutally powerful now. A big 6 shots at strength 7 AP -2 damage 2, 6s causing 1 mortal wound. He ignores dense cover, and casualties count as 2 casualties for the purpose of morale. With his quality fire, that does mean that he is quite likely to inflict some morale tests on the opponents. I think Commandress is looking particularly intimidating at 140 points. He's up from 135. Like the Striking Scorpions, he gets advanced positions to forward deploy, so he could potentially threaten for turn-worn charges and redeploy with Phantasm. He no longer buffs the Scorpions melee, but giving them obsec is pretty decent, and he is an all-round general combatant. His chainsword is strength +2, AP -2, damage 1, and a big 12 attacks. or he can attack with that Claw at strength 8, AP -4, damage 2, and throws out some hefty shurikens as well. He's got improved Manda Blasters as well, wound rolls of 6 cause 2 mortal wounds against non-vehicle units, and he also gets the sustained assault exploding 6s to hit. There aren't a whole ton of enemies that really want to be in combat with him, particularly as he's really quite tough and durable in return, between the 2+ armor, invul save, and the 3 wounds thing. Then we have Azamon, down to 150 from 160. His shurikens are fairly decent at shooting, 24 inches, assault 6, strength 4, AP -2, damage 2. The Sword of Azure is strength 6, AP -3, damage 2, 6 causing D3 mortal wounds. He retains his 3+ invul, kind of a rarity in 9th edition 40k, and he doesn't have any boosted Overwatch or buffing Dire Avengers nearby anymore. Fugan's the most expensive of the Phoenix Lords, up to 160 points from 135, though he is looking fairly mighty. He was already strength 5 base, but now is toughness 5 as well, so is arguably the toughest out of any of them. His relic Firepike Seer Song, that's basically a strength 10 Firepike with AP -4 and damage D6 +4. It can also fire it as a beam attack as well, with strength 6, AP -3 and damage 4, and the potential to hit multiple units. Like the Fire Dragons, he rerolls 1 to wound against vehicles and monsters, and loses, and is still a fairly respectable combatant with those extra attacks and that fire axe of his. Jane Zar's up to 140 points from 125. Her Silent Death is now an assault 6, strength 6, AP -3, damage 1 Triskel, and the Blade of Destruction has 2 different modes, either +2 strength, AP -3 and damage 2, or double attacks at strength 4 and AP -3. The Banshee Mask is a boosted one as well. It still cancels Overwatch, it's picked up that Fight's Last ability, which is crazily handy on a character, and also grants the enemy unit -1 attack as well, so they're not going to hit back quite as hard. Like the Howling Banshees, she's also got her inbuilt -1 to hit now, so for just 15 points between all the standard Phoenix Lord buffs and all of this, she's come out of it rather well. Finally, exemplifying the redeploying shenanigans of the Swooping Hawks, Barahoth is 140 points, up from 120, and he seems to work very similar to the Swooping Hawks in general now, fairly low damage, but absolutely crazy in terms of being able to redeploy. His Hawk Talon is jumped up to strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2, still having the 6s to hit auto wound thing. The Shining Blade is strength 5, AP -3 and damage 2 with exploding 6s to hit, though his crazy thing is that he gets to redeploy like the same way as the Swooping Hawks do, and not only can he do this when he shoots, but he can also do this when he consolidates as well. So I think in general his plan each turn will generally be to deep strike somewhere safe, move out to get in charge range of something, blast something with the Hawk's Talon, charge something else, and then jump up into the sky when he consolidates before the opponent can even attack him back. Honestly, he sounds like a bit of a nightmare to deal with. Seems hard to stop him from doing at least something pretty painful every single turn. Overall, a lot of really fun stuff from the Phoenix Lords here. I think Karandras, Jane Zar, and Barahoth are all looking particularly interesting for me. Karandras is looking particularly mighty, Jane Zar's just got so many layered special rules like her Banshees, and Barahoth just seems crazily annoying and a really fun model to use for basically no chance of the opponent getting any counter attack. That just about brings us to the end for the main Craftworlds rule section, so we'll get into Harlequins in a second. Overall though, I think that for pure Craftworld armies they are looking incredibly strong indeed. Perhaps a lot of their units are a bit limited by low range, so they really are going to have to make good use of their movement to get in range and then get back to safety. But there's some seriously scary stuff here. I think Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions on the charge look pretty terrifying. Drop Podding Falcons full of Fire Dragons looks like it could be a thing. Plenty of fearsome Ignore's line of sight weapons, including those D cannons. After doing a bit of heavy lifting, I think that Wraith Lords or Wraith Blades with shields look like they could be really good with that -1 damage. There's a whole ton of options though. It's going to be interesting to see what people make work in competitive lists. It really does feel like a book where you can go in multiple different directions, and hopefully there'll be a few different builds that the book can make work. I do feel that we're going to be likely seeing a lot of Ulthway lists though. Moving swiftly on though, as there's still plenty more to cover, let's get into the Harlequins. So the followers of the Laughing God have their own section of the book, and get really quite a lot of special rules all of their own. I didn't list it here, but they do get that travelling players thing, basically allowing them to include a patrol in a Craftworlds or Drukhari detachment, and it doesn't stop them getting their army-wide special rules, like Power from Pain or the Strands of Fate, and it doesn't stop them taking their unique secondaries either. I feel like that's quite a fun and fluffy implementation of narrative rules in-game. Allows you to take some Harlequins, but maybe not get quite as many of them. Otherwise, the Clown Eldar retain really quite a lot of their nice special rules. Harlequins Panoply seem to combine the rules for holosuits and flip belts, so this is what the infantry models get, A 4+ invul, they get to move through enemy models and terrain as if it weren't there, and a new bonus that they're always -1 to hit in melee as well, so makes them a little bit tougher there. Rising Crescendo is the one that basically all the infantry and the bikes get, so not the vehicles like the Star Weavers or Void Weavers. This basically gives them advance and charge, and fallback shoot and charge, so you're never going to pin down the Harlequins in combat, and they're still going to be able to strike from a ridiculous amount of distance away. We'll get onto their Saedath rules in a minute. Saedaths replaced their masks. There used to be 6 masks, but now there's only 3 Saedaths, though their rules are quite powerful. Finally, Harlequins also have an army-wide mechanic called Luck of the Laughing God. This one's what you get if you choose to field an entire army of Harlequins and not soup them up with the Craftworlders or the Dark Eldar. It maybe feels like a slightly more simplistic version of Strands of Fate. Again, it's going to be manipulating dice through the battle, and it basically gives you an extra bunch of rerolls for when your Harlequins are running around fighting. You get 1 reroll in a combat patrol game, 2 for incursion, 3 for strike force, or 4 for onslaught, and then you have the chance to gamble for a few more. You roll up to 6d6, you choose how many, and if every result is unique, you get that many extra dice. Basically, if you roll 6d6, you have almost 0 chance of making it. I believe it maths out that the best rolls to do are either 2 or 3 dice. I believe they both average you around about 1.6 Laughing God rerolls on average, the 3-1 being a bit more swingy. You either get lots or none. In any case, you can trade these out for a bit of extra damage, defense, or mobility, as the Laughing God dice rerolls can only be used for things like hit rolls, wound rolls, damage rolls, saving throws, and advance rolls. Notably, you can't use them to reroll charges or psychic tests, which I think will be the most valuable uses for them. So they're kind of like mini command rerolls, and maybe mean that you can just save your command point rerolls for the important charges and psychic tests. Damage rolls of 1 are going to be really good value for that. Saving throws are going to be nice with their decent 4+ invul saves, and advances are very relevant seeing as they're going to lengthen your charge threat. If you're playing Harlequins at 2000 points, you're typically going to have something like 4 or 5 Luck of the Laughing God dice, fair few fun rerolls to play around over the battle round, and then any unused dice are lost at the end of that battle round. Quite a fun feels good mechanic, will certainly add up to a fair few saved Harlequins or extra damage, and hopefully some command rerolls save for some more important things. Still though, not crazily powerful as faction-wide special buffs go. Very much feels like a nice to have, but you could certainly play Harlequins without these. So first up, let's talk through these 3 different Saedaths then. These are Light, Dark and Twilight. Saedaths apparently representing mask fighting styles that different Harlequins ascribe to. The Light one's characterization is Blaze of Light. This means that when they're attacked at greater than 12 inches away, hit rolls of 1 to 3 always fail, so really punishing for armies like Custodes with great ballistic skill. And if they move or advance, they count as stationary for shooting, really quite nice for firing off those fusion pistols or assault weapons, and gives things like Void Weavers a further boost of speed. Their Warlord trait is Player of the Light. This gives him a 6-inch heroic intervention, and when he's charging or making a heroic intervention, it's +1 strength and +1 attack. Both of those kind of useful and seem good enough to me. Their relic is the Shadowstone. Kind of a shame that this isn't a generic one that any of them can take now, but it basically gives a +3-inch aura of Shadowseer powers. A very easy pickup, that one. That's a really good relic. Finally, their stratagem is Capricious Reflections for 1 CP. I think this one's very powerful indeed, and another great draw to the Saedath. When you're charged, 1 light unit gets to move 6 inches when it was charged, giving you a very good chance at making an enemy successful charge fail, and you could even use it for gamey things like repositioning onto objectives potentially. Overall, I think that light is just all around strong. Every bit of it seems really useful, particularly the 1 to 3 always failing thing, the Shadowstone, and that great stratagem. Next up, the Dark Saedath has its characterization for Dark Deeds. Models slain in melee get to fight in death if they haven't already fought, and they get AP -1 better as well, just in general. If you're going very melee heavy on the Harlequins, this one seems pretty reasonable. It's quite nice to have their Harlequins kit and other unique weapons go to AP -3, and it does mean that the opponent's almost always going to be paying a hefty price when they charge to kill one of your units. It's really going to punish enemy melee armies. Their Warlord trait, Player of the Dark, allows wound rolls of a 5+ in melee to also inflict a mortal wound. That could easily add up to a few extra per turn, particularly with certain relics. The Ghoul Mask allows you an extra Deny the Witch, as if you were a Psyker, if you were a Troop Master or something, say, and also grants a 3-inch aura of enemies losing Obsec. That will be great in tandem with a standard troop. The Silken Knife for 1 CP means enemy units can't overwatch or set to defend. Maybe a little bit more low-key this one, but Harlequins are certainly really vulnerable to getting blown away by a fearsome volley of overwatch fire, so again it's a very nice tool to have in the bag. Again, just in general, it really is all round strong. perhaps particularly so if you're using a whole ton of troops with Harlequins Blades or Kisses or Caresses. Finally, the third option is Twilight, and again this one's a massive melee one. Their characterization, Twilight's Falls, gives you +1 attack in the first round of melee, and piling and consolidate of an extra 2 inches. I think extra melee damage is rarely going to be a bad thing, particularly with all of these fancy attacks. It maybe just seems like the easiest and most straightforward one to use. Their Warlord trait, Player of Twilight, allows every command point spent by your opponent to roll a 6 to try and regenerate one, and also it's a small reward if you gamble on the luck dice for the luck of the Laughing God. If you choose to roll 4 or more dice, then you gain a command point regardless of what you roll, though that is going to decrease the amount that will be coming in on average. I would bear in mind that you can only farm 1 command point per turn with this, but having 2 different mechanics to do so is kind of handy, I guess. Their Relic Power Sword really is quite brutal. A Troop Master's Sword becomes Strength +2, AP -3 and Damage 2, and then they get extra attacks equal to the number of the current battle round, so kind of hilariously between the Troop Master's 6 attacks, Battle Round 5 and the Twilight characterization, that could be 12 attacks at that profile in the last round. Finally, for 1 CP we have Malicious Frenzy, 6 to hit auto wound for a unit in melee. In general the Harlequins do have very low strength, so this is really awesome just as a damage boost, and combines really nicely with their characterization for an overlap of just murderous Harlequins. I feel like this one could be the one to go for if you're just feeling really unsubtle and you just want to devastate enemies with massive combat troops or Skyweavers with Zephyr Glaives, and also seems really solid. I'm quite impressed that there's genuinely interesting stuff for every single one of those. I think that people might experiment with most. I feel that Twilight is probably going to be an easy one to fall back on though if you're unsure. Massive extra melee damage on melee units rarely goes too far wrong. Next up we've got the reinterpretation of Harlequin pivotal roles, kind of similar in the Exarch Powers to function now. Each of their characters gets the option to buy an upgrade for points, powerful extra buffs either to their command abilities or what they can do in combat. For the Troop Master, for 20 points there's Prince of Light. Core Harlequins within 6 inches get +1 to charge. The core units are the Bikers, and I believe it should be the troops as well. I guess that particularly works quite well if they're emerging from the webway. For 25 points there's Queen of Shards, unmodified wounds in melee of 5+, ignore invul saves. That looks like it could be pretty brutal with that Twilight Sword that we just talked about, a crazy amount of high AP attacks at damage 2, you're almost bound to be getting a fair few 5s. Finally for 20 points there's Veiled King, melee attacks automatically wound on a 2+, unless they're fighting against vehicles or monsters. Again, that does seem really quite hard to go wrong with, going to be particularly handy against any mid-strength things like tough Terminators or Bikers who might be toughness 5 or even 6. Overall they seem pretty solid for what you get. I think I might be tempted by Veiled King out of them, in combination with a Fighty Warlord trait and Relic. For the Death Jester, for 15 points we have Harvester of Torment. This one's a small shooting boost, unmodified hit rolls of 6 cause 3 additional hits. Typically I believe that would equate to around about a 60% boost to his shooting. Seems good value when the entire model is just 55 points. For 20 points there's Lord of Crystal Bones. This allows hits versus non-vehicles and monsters to cause -2 inch movement, and he can't overwatch or set to defense. Having a source of ignores overwatch is pretty handy, although you are paying a bit more of a price for it now at 20 points. The movement thing though certainly doesn't hurt, I guess. Finally for 20 points we have Rift Ghoul, ignores cover and wound rolls of 4+, cause 1 mortal wound in addition to normal damage. That is going to reliably chip away at enemy units, maybe a bit more niche that one I think. I think you'd take several turns worth of firepower to reliably make any sort of points back. Again though, doesn't really hurt, particularly when you can target characters. For the Shadowseer, for 30 points we have Agent of Pandemonium. This one's a fairly powerful melee debuff. Enemies within 6 inches subtract 1 from their attack stat. Certainly would take the bite out of enemy combat, though I must admit I wouldn't really want the Shadowseer on the front lines if I could avoid it. For 20 points, Gloom Spider again requires you to be close. You've got to be in your command phase, and 1 enemy unit within 12 inches can't receive any aura abilities. Feels a little bit situational for the cost, you'd sort of want to have an enemy core unit rushing straight at you. Finally for 25 points we have Mirror Architect. I'm glad that this one stayed from the previous version of the book. Basically Harlequin units within 6 inches count as being 6 inches further away from enemy shooting than normal. A really nice debuff for keeping a bunch of Harlequins safe early in the game. In particular this one really messes with low range weapons. Anything that's 12 inches would now have to be 6 inches to get hits on Harlequins. It's really going to ruin the day for things like Flamers. As more of a buffing character, I think that Mirror Architect one is definitely the one that I'd be going for. Finally we have the Solitaire, who still has really fun stats as we'll see. For 20 points he gets Prince of Sins, -1 to hit and hit rolls can't be re-rolled against him, an OK durability buff, To be fair, that certainly would make him a lot more annoying to remove if he is up close to the enemy, particularly with that 3+ invul. For 15 points he has Spectre of Despair. This allows him to deep strike, and his charge rolls become 3d6 drop the lowest. If you want to use him as a pop-up threat, then this seems to be the way to do so. Then for 20 points we have Thirsting Darkness. This seems to be the option for starting on the board and getting a massive threat range. He auto advances 6 inches for 18-inch movement essentially, and then he piles in or consolidates an extra 3 inches each, hopefully meaning that he's going to be in the optimal position when he's done fighting. All seem handy enough, to be honest. I'm maybe a little bit less convinced about how necessary they are though. He seems to do pretty fine for his points cost at the moment. Maybe Spectre of Despair is the one that's most interesting for me. Having a Solitaire emerge from deep strike to charge in does seem pretty brutal. Next up, while we mentioned that they have really quite a lot of stratagems from the core Aeldari Codex, Harlequins do have quite a lot of their own, basically 2 more pages of stratagems all for themselves. A fair few of them do make triumphant returns from previous codexes, but they have lost a few powerful ones. Things like, for example, that jet bike one where they charge in and then run away before they can get fought back. That one does appear to be gone. For battle tactics, we have 2 CP for Prismatic Blur. An infantry unit advances 8 inches and gains a 3+ invul save. That seems like a pretty high value one for a troop unit on foot moving forward. Going to be a huge threat range of 16 inches plus a charge there, and the 3+ invul save should make it harder to kill them in return. Segarak's Jest is a useful one for an infantry unit. When the enemy falls back from you, you either get to consolidate immediately 6 inches for 2 CP, or immediately shoot the enemy unit that just fell back. Certainly a potential gotcha moment there. The opponent might fall back and still find themselves in combat. Pretty brutal, sometimes means that the enemy is just not going to be able to fall back from your troops. Probably one best to mention before the game begins. For 1 CP, Virtuosos of the Webway allow you to put any unit not in engagement range into strategic reserves. Maybe a nice one for late game redeployment and getting some crafty secondaries going around the back of the enemy army. For 2 CP we have Murderous Spectacle. An infantry unit charging gets +1 damage to a maximum of damage 3. Unfortunately not usable on those Zephyrglaives anymore for a big damage 3 on those weapons. Still though, it seems very powerful either on the blades or on the unique weapons. And last for battle tactics, for 3 CP there's War Dancers, a big fighty one where the troop unit gets to fight again once per battle round. If it makes the difference between killing an enemy unit or not, could well be worth the big investment. Then moving on for Epic Deeds, no price too steep means a character unit gets to fight on death. Always nice enough if you know that you're going to be able to put through some really meaningful damage with that. And what's more, if the attacking model is a Solitaire or you are fighting against Chaos, then the fighting model gets +1 attack and +1 strength when it goes down. That looks ridiculously scary for killing Solitaires in combat. You could lose an entire elite infantry squad to that sort of combat. For 1 CP, Hero's Path has changed a bit. It's now just for 2 models, a Troop Master and either a Death Jester or a Shadow Seer. They both get +2 inch movement and +1 to charge this turn. I guess gives them a bit of a surge to getting towards the enemy. For 1 CP, Torment of the Fiery Pit makes characters a little bit more dangerous if they've lost wounds. When they're fighting in combat they get +1 strength and attack. Seems pretty nice if that is going to make the difference of getting to a strength wound breakpoint. Say maybe jumping up to strength 6 when your opponent's got toughness 6. Lastly for Epic Deeds, for 1 CP there's Dramatic Entrance. Again this one's changed a bit, and it now basically lets any infantry unit heroically intervene to 6 inch range. Good to have the increased threat range on the characters, and another reason why the enemy army just wants to be absolutely nowhere near Harlequin troops, with so many ways of them to get into combat or fall back and shoot and move through their ranks. There's a Requisition Stratagem next, 1 CP for Favourite of the Laughing God. If your Warlord is a Harlequin, they can get a second trait from that same table. Pretty powerful that. Between the pivotal role, then you can have a very fighty Troop Master going on. For Strategic Ploys, first up we have 1 CP for the Curtain Falls. 1 infantry unit embarks on a transport if every model is within 3 inches of it after fighting. Another potential one to allow them to charge into combat and fight and then get away before the enemy hits them back. And for the Death Jester, for 1 CP there's Mocking Laughter. An enemy unit within 12 inches can't use the Insane Bravery strat, they can't reroll morale tests by any means, and if they need to test morale this phase, then they also fail any actions they were doing. Could be situationally good if you think they're going to lose some morale casualties, or it's really important that just the last model flees. Finally, we have 4 War Gear Stratagems. For 1 CP there's Haywire Charge. A unit with Haywire Grenades makes a single attack. If it hits a vehicle, then it causes D3 mortal wounds. Not bad for a last bit of chip damage if you need it, at a grenade at 6 inch range. And then we basically have the 3 different Harlequin Special Weapon Stratagems. You get access to these by having one of the weapons in question within the unit. It seems that you only need the one to access the whole strat. The Harlequins Kiss allows you to cause 1 mortal wound on each unmodified wound roll of a 6, up to a maximum of 6 if you do roll really high. For 2 CP, Oblivion's Caress allows you to ignore invul saves. The unique weapons are largely going to be AP-2, so that one could be more relevant for the Dark Mask, or potentially if you're fighting something that relies on invul saves like demons perhaps. Finally, for 1 CP, a Deadly Embrace allows a sort of impact mortal wound mechanic for a unit within Embrace. You target a non-vehicle or monster unit, and you cause 1 mortal wound per model that you have on a 4+, again to a maximum of 6. Seems like that could be a very strong impact if you are charging in with a big squad of say 10 troops. A few notable losses here, but a lot of these do seem really quite nice. Still a whole ton of crazily painful tricks that even if the opponent leaves a few Harlequins alive, they're really going to regret it. I quite like just how many options the troops have in particular. Loads of options for getting a bit of extra damage output or do something painful when they're locked in combat. And I feel like out of the war gear ones, maybe the Harlequins Kiss one might be one of the most reliable. Could punch through a bit more damage output against hard targets. Next up we've got the Harlequins Warlord traits and relics, and I must admit this is one of the sections that has been impacted a bit by going to a smaller codex. They have lost a fair few options of both of these here, including things like relic shrieker cannons, though again maybe that latter one has been made up by the Death Jester being quite so good on his base profile now. For Warlord traits there are now just the 3. The first one is Favour of Segarak. You get to change 1 hit, wound or save roll to a 6 once per turn after rolling. Seems really powerful on a saving throw in particular, basically auto pass your invul save, and doubly so because it's after rolling as opposed to before. Small but kind of helpful. Next up, Fractal Storm means that the enemy can't re-roll hits, wounds or damage against them. A handy enough durability increase, though still a tiny bit situational. I think probably out of them, my favourite is a Foot in the Future, which allows you to advance D3 plus 3 inches. And I'm kind of confused that it appears to be charging plus 6 inches as well, so a ridiculously long charge distance, though of course you can only declare on units within 12. Still though, that basically means that your Harlequin's character is going to be moving about as fast as a jet bike, maybe 13-inch movement from the advance, and then usually going to be at least 12 inches with the charge roll, if not more. Should allow some pretty optimal positioning there. I think of those, probably that one is my favourite of the 3, though to be honest all the Saedaths specific ones, I think they're probably more interesting on the whole. Relics wise, first we have the Storied Sword. This one's strength +2, AP-3 and damage 2. The attacks auto hit. A very reliable 6 strength 5 attacks at that profile from the Troop Master there. The Suit of Hidden Knives gives you 3 extra attacks against non-titanic units. All they do is just 1 mortal wounds against enemy units if they hit. So again, that's just some ridiculously reliable extra melee damage output. Considering things like Troop Masters hit on 2s, that's going to be 2 or 3 mortal wounds almost all of the time. Crescendo is a shuriken pistol that's going to hit harder than a shuriken cannon a lot of the time. A 12-inch pistol with a big 6 shots, strength 4, AP-3 and damage 2 with the shuriken rule. The low strength means that you might not get all that many wound rolls through, but even against things like toughness 7 vehicles, I think you're more likely than not to get at least 2 wounds through on them. Pretty surprisingly potent for a relic pistol. Segarak's Rose is a Harlequin's Kiss, which is strength +2, AP-2 and damage 3, and gets to re-roll the wound rolls. I feel like that's maybe going to be a bit better than the Storied Sword on average. Splatting 3 wound infantry in a single wound is really nice, and also with the high damage and reroll wounds it's going to be quite good against punching up against things like toughness 7 or 8 things, particularly on top of any of the other Troop Master buffs that you can get from pivotal rolls or Warlord traits. The Star Mist Raiment is a defensive buff. The enemy can't reroll hits or wounds versus the bearer, and in your command phase you get to activate a 3+ invul save that lasts until your next one. Seems alright to make one character surprisingly hard to kill, maybe particularly if he thinks he's going to get interrupted against maybe. And finally there's one called the Laughing God's Eye, a defensive relic that's a 6-inch aura of 5+ to save against mortal wounds. Certainly no real bad thing in the meta of 40k at the moment. Could be nice to have at the centre of a whole bunch of Sky Weavers or Star Weavers if you are playing against something like Thousand Suns or Grey Knights. So overall I feel like the Warlord traits are maybe a bit tame. Perhaps the Saedath ones are a bit more impressive. Most of the relics do seem pretty useful though. The Storied Sword, Suit of Hidden Knives and Segarak's Rose do seem pretty nice for just making a character more fighty, and there's a couple of nice defensive ones as well. Next up for the Shadow Seers we have the Phantasmancy Discipline. Buffs here are all locked to the same as Saedath. Twilight Pathways is Warp Charge 6 and 6-inch range. One core or character unit gets to move and advance but can't charge. Kind of an expected tone down on the previous one, very similar to the Quicken one from the Warlock discipline. Quite nice that they're still able to shoot though. You could still do a bit of a drive-by with something like some shuriken cannons or haywire cannons. Fog of Dreams is Warp Charge 6 and 12-inch in range. One core or character unit can only be shot if it's the closest unit or less than 12 inches from the enemy. Good protection on something that needs to be out in the open for a turn, particularly if you've got a few other lower value targets like some Starweavers bossing around as well perhaps. Mirror of Minds is warp charge 7 and 18-inch range. This one generates D3 mortal wounds, and then you repeatedly roll off with your opponent. Each time if you win or draw, then you deal a mortal wound and roll again, and the spell ends when the enemy either beats you, or the enemy target is destroyed or has taken 6 mortal wounds. Not bad for a bit of offensive mortal wound generation there. Veil of Tears is warp charge 7 and 18-inch range. This one's now a debuff on an enemy unit where they can't target any Harlequins greater than 18 inches away. Could certainly annoy a big gunline unit maybe, but I feel that this one's maybe a little bit lower value. Shards of Light is warp charge 6 and 18 inches, another mortal wound generating one. One visible unit suffers 1 mortal wound, or D3 mortal wounds if it's a vehicle, monster, or has 6 or more models in the unit. They also take -2 leadership as well, so it could be nice to combine with things like Death Jesters for trying to inflict morale casualties. Finally, we have Webway Dance at warp charge 7 and a 6-inch aura ability. Harlequin units within the aura get a 6+ feel no pain type save. Not exactly the strongest defensive buff in the world, but it's not nothing, and it does synergize very well with the Shadowseer's existing abilities. The -1 to wound thing, and maybe the range extension if you've taken that pivotal role. I think that Webway Dance one will probably be quite popular. Twilight Pathways for a bit more mobility, even if you can't charge after it. And I think maybe out of the rest, Mirror of Minds is probably the best out of them. Its average mortal wound amount is really quite impressive, and it might give you a cheeky chance to try and snipe characters, maybe combining with a Death Jester perhaps. Next, before we get into Harlequins Datasheets, they do have 3 different secondaries. Again, these ones can only be taken if you're only taking Harlequins and nothing else. A Deadly Performance is a no mercy, no respite one. 3 victory points if you do 2 or more of these actions by the end of your turn. First up, the easy one is control an objective that you didn't at the start of your turn. Secondly, a Harlequins unit is entirely within the enemy deployment zone. Maybe not the hardest when you've got massive movement like they do. Otherwise, 2 or more enemy units being killed by ranged weapons with Harlequins, or 3 or more enemy units being killed by melee weapons with Harlequins. Things that might well just happen naturally, but at the same time are maybe a little bit hard to plan to do. What with enemies interrupting and things, and maybe some squads having the chance to roll low. Still though, I feel like the first 2 objectives on that are going to be relatively easy to achieve with the speed and power of Harlequins. They're going to be pretty well suited to outmaneuvering the enemy and repeatedly punching them off the objectives. Take Your Places is a battlefield supremacy one. This allows you to set up 1 objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone, and then your opponent sets up 2 new objectives as well, 1 within your deployment zone and 1 within 6 inches of the centre of the board. At the end of the turn, if you control 2 of them, you get 2 victory points, or if you control 3 of them, then it's 4 victory points. I feel like this one is going to be putting a lot of points on the board that you're going to want to contest. These on top of the primary objectives does seem a little bit onerous, particularly as your opponent deploys a couple of them, so they could really encourage your units to be standing out right in the open. Seems doable, but I feel that you might be sacrificing quite a lot to get those points. Finally, we have Weave Veil for Warpcraft. This allows 1 Shadowseer a turn to do a Warp Charge 4 psychic action within 12 inches of an enemy unit. If the action is completed, you gain 3 victory points, the Warp Charge cost increases by +1 for the rest of the game, and that enemy unit in particular is said to be veiled and can't be selected for this again. That one does seem like it could be potentially fairly easy to do. I guess the biggest downsides are if your opponent has tons of Deny the Witch, and it might encourage you to play a little bit more aggressively with the Shadowseers, who again don't really want to be right next to enemy units and mixed up in melee. Overall, again like the standard Craftworld ones, they do all seem fairly usable. I'd say maybe the Deadly Performance one looks like it could be the most reliable out of them, provided you have a few fast-moving sacrificial units that are going to be jumping into the enemy and trying to kill them dead. It seems almost inevitable that you're going to get quite a lot of victory points for this one if you focus it, and you might well just look at and trigger a few of the enemy units killing ones as you go about trying to win the battle. Finally, for the Harlequins, let's take a talk through their datasheets. Obviously not the biggest section in any codex in 40k, but they do have some very interesting and hard-hitting units. The troop squad is now 13 points per model, down from 14, and they've gained a lead player, character leader for the unit, who gets +1 wound and can take a power sword for 5 points, so sort of like a mini troop master. The Harlequin's blade is stronger than it was before. It's gained AP -1 and +1 attack to 5 attacks now. They are at strength 3 though, so they are still going to struggle at punching up against anything but light infantry. Their special weapons, the Harlequin's Kiss, Caress and Embrace, are all +1 strength, AP -2 and damage 2 now, combining the best of a few of their profiles I think, and like I said before, they do access the various different stratagems. Unfortunately, to reflect the choices that are available in the box, Games Workshop has limited the datasheet slightly. Any number of the players can take the kiss, but only 2 models within a 5-man squad can take a caress or embrace, or up to 4 models if you've got 11 or more in the unit. It does seem that you only need 1 of each to activate the stratagem for the whole unit though, as best I can tell, so maybe that's not the biggest deal as they're all the same profile anyway. Perhaps the saddest change on the unit though are that the pistols are more limited as well. Fusion pistols have been upgraded a bit, with 5 points and now just getting a d6 plus 2 damage at base wherever you shoot from, but again they follow the same amount that you can take as the caresses or embraces, so you're only getting 2 fusion pistols per 5 model troop squad, or 4 in a 10 model troop squad. It does mean that the big troop drive-by tactic, flying around in Star Weavers, isn't going to be quite as viable. They haven't actually lost all that much ground against the standard fusion pistols, at least when fired against hard targets due to the d6 plus 2 damage, but they're going to be a bit less overwhelming in shooting against elite infantry now. In any case, I think I'd still rather take them over the Ynnari Disruptor. That's the one that gets a single shot at strength 6, AP-3, damage 1, and if you hit a non-vehicle unit, then they take a mortal wound and the attack sequence ends. Weirdly enough, it does appear that the Harlequins troop doesn't have the core keyword. I certainly believe that they should have it. It seems weird that for some reason the bikers appear to have it and they don't, but they do also have haywire grenades. Seems like that's one for the errata at least. Otherwise, for the fast-moving Harlequin jet bikes, we have the Sky Weavers remaining at 45 points. They are a core unit, and they get +1 attack on their base profile to 4, and the buffed profile of the Shuriken Cannon, which you might actually want to take over the Haywire Cannon now, perhaps. Haywire Cannons are +5 points, 24 inches, heavy D3 +1, strength 3, AP-3, damage D3, get the blast keyword, always wound vehicles on a 4+, and on a 6 to wound vehicles they deal an extra D3 mortal wounds as well. Basically, if you're firing at vehicles, they're going to be massively better. If you're firing against most other things, they're going to be a bit worse. Kind of nice that there's a bit more of a choice between the two now, rather than the Haywire Cannon just being easily the best. Defense-wise, they are now -1 to hit only in melee, not at range. I guess that makes the Light Devotion a little bit more useful. They do have Mirage launchers that mean that you can't reroll hits against the unit though. They keep their 4+ invul, and they still have 3 wounds, so they are at least fairly meaty. The Zephyrglaive is +5 points for now, strength +2, AP-2 and damage 2, so gained a pip of strength there. And the Star Bowlers have increased to strength 7 and aren't a grenade weapon anymore, so you can fire multiple of them in a single turn. They have lost access to a fair few useful stratagems though. A lot of things seem to be locked to infantry or have just gone altogether. Still though, with their speed, firepower and melee damage, they are going to remain a premier damage dealing unit. Otherwise, for the transports, the Star Weaver hasn't really seen too many changes. It's 80 points, just the same as it was before. It's still -1 to hit and has a 4+ invul save, and has gained the ability that enemies can't reroll hits against it anymore, the same as the Sky Weavers have. The biggest change for this guy is the fairly massive upgrade to Shuriken Cannons. Gaining AP-1 and damage 2 actually does mean that you have to take this thing's firepower a bit more seriously now. Finally, I think the Void Weaver has gone from a really underwhelming jet bike to a slightly interesting one. It's 90 points up from 80. You can now take them in squadrons of 1 to 3, so it does mean that you can actually have quite a lot of them on the board. I think that's quite a nice touch to be honest, particularly given how limited the Harlequins unit pool is. Like the Star Weaver, they gain an extra attack for some reason, and Mirage launchers also prevent enemies re-rolling hit rolls. Both of their guns have been colossally buffed though. The Prismatic Cannon is basically being a mini fire prism now, heavy 2, strength 12, AP-4 and damage 2d3. Really not bad at all when its focus profile was less than half of that before, and it can go after infantry as well, with 3d3 shots at strength 5, AP-3 and damage 1. I think honestly in terms of firepower for the points that's really quite impressive, particularly considering when it's also backed up with 2 different Shuriken Cannons as well. For 90 points and that sort of crazy mobility, these things hit really hard. Otherwise though, the Haywire Cannon's 24-inch range, 2d3 shots for this one, and a bit more strength and damage than the Skyweaver version. Again, it wounds vehicles on a 4+, and 6s to wound cause D3 mortal wounds as well. It does seem perhaps fairly comparable at first glance. I think I'm more interested in the Prismatic Cannon out of the two. Quite fun that they've got a nice buff though, they haven't been particularly strong in quite a while. Finally, we have the 4 different Harlequin characters. Troop Masters on their main profile maybe have seen a bit of a downgrade if anything though. He's 75 points up from 65, has gained 1 attack to 6, but his Choreographer of War ability has been nerfed. You now re-roll wound rolls of 1 for nearby Harlequins, not all wound rolls. It's certainly not all bad news though. He gets that new Panoply rules for the -1 to hit in combat. gets the improved special weapons for 10 points each, and can take a fusion pistol for 5 points. Still seems great in combination with the various different things that you can layer on him. Shadowseers though look better than ever, down to 100 points from 115. They've also gained an attack. The Myth Stave hits a little bit harder at +3 strength now, and they can take a Neuro Disruptor for 5 points extra. The Hallucinogen Grenade Launcher now gets D3 shots and blast, but you only get 1 mortal wound on the 2d6 versus leadership thing, not D3. Shield from Harm though has been a little bit improved if anything. It now works on all core and character units, so it works on the bikes now just at base, though I don't believe that there's any way of making it affect the transports anymore. That will be waiting on the core unit for troops though, which I'm sure will arrive via an FAQ. Overall though, I think that Shadowseers are likely to be more popular than ever. The psychic powers remain good, potentially giving 6+ feel no pain, extra range, and also the -1 to wound thing. It is going to make the core of your army a lot tougher to take out. The Solitaire is potentially looking more dangerous than ever though, 110 points up from 100, but it does seem that he's gained enough things to go with that. Strength and toughness have been both boosted to 4 from 3. The Solitaire's weapons are now represented by Strength +2, AP -3, Damage 2 with 8 attacks, and he gets both the Harlequins Kiss and Harlequins Caress keywords, potentially allowing some really powerful stratagems. For 2 CP that means he can punch straight through invul saves with this massive amount of attacks. Say goodbye to any Space Marines with Storm Shields, I guess. He retains that 3+ invul save to make him problematic to take out. He can't take relics or warlord traits. He still gets the massive move characteristic of 12 and the blitz rule for an extra 2d6 inches move and +2 attacks for 1 spectacular turn of carnage. Still seems pretty monstrously dangerous for soloing an entire squad of enemy elites. Finally we have the Spooky Death Jester, up to 55 points from 50. He gains an attack to 5, and he does have a little bit of his own combat weapons now, at Strength +1, AP -1 and Damage 1 from his Jester's Blade. Still though, he's not exactly going to be doing very much in melee. That Shrieker Cannon though seems to have taken a lot of the best bits of the relics and put everything together. It's an Assault 3 Shuriken Cannon with 30-inch range, Strength 6, AP -2 and Damage 2 with the Shuriken word, so it's some pretty spectacular buffs compared with previously, gaining range, AP and damage. With that profile, he's going to be better than ever against enemy characters. He can target them directly, and I can imagine something like a few Death Jesters in a Starweaver being a pretty potent character assassin force. With that amount of firepower, you could have a very decent chance of sniping a support character in a single round of shooting. If they are going after demoralizing the foe and causing morale shenanigans though, slain models now count as 2 for morale, though they lost the ability to influence which models flee in the unit, and they don't have that shriek around rule anymore, where if you kill a model then they take more mortal wounds. Overall though, that looks absolutely great for 55 points. You can buff him further with pivotal rolls if you want. Unless character models are bodyguard protected or have -1 damage, they should be tumbling fairly quickly. Overall, I think it's really quite a decent set of bonuses for the Harlequin troop units. I think the balance might swing a bit further in their favour and maybe a little away from the Skyweaver jet bikes, though it is kind of a shame to see boats full of fusion pistols going away. They're going to be forced to have a bit more of a combination of range and melee damage, not just the range. I think we'll also see a fair few more Void Weavers than we did before. They look like a genuinely solid fire support unit for the army now, particularly backed up by a few rerolls from Luck of the Laughing God. Overall, I think it's broadly good news for the Harlequins. At least in army power level, I think they've gained more than they've lost. A lot of buffed unit profiles and things. It is a shame to lose some masked warlord traits and relics, but at least these new Saedaths that they get are very strong indeed, and I think they've done particularly well in implementing their allies rules. It really does feel like you could include a detachment of them alongside some Aeldari, and still have decent rewards for running them as an entire Harlequins detachment with that luck mechanic. For an army that's got so few units, I think they've done quite well to make them into a fairly well-rounded force. Finally, we get on to the Ynnari, kind of the third major Aeldari faction of the book, and their rules have been shaken up quite a bit. I'd say out of anyone, maybe these have lost a little bit more than some of them, but again, maybe similar to the Harlequins, they're still going to be far, far stronger than they were before. They were really kind of bottom tier for competitive play. First up, Ynnari kind of function as a weird sort of Aeldari Craftworld, more or less. They get battle focus and Strands of Fate on the relevant units. The core of their army is going to be a Craftworld one plus their unique datasheets, but they have really quite a nice detachment rule where they can mix in units from the other codexes. They can include units like Harlequins, Witch Cult units, Cabal units, and Incubi or Scourges, though they are locked out of a fair few selections. They can't take the Avatar of Cain, Phoenix Lords, and Wraith Units, the Solitaire, or any named characters. Their detachment restriction is that basically the core of the force must be made up of Craftworld units. Basically, for each battlefield role within the detachment, you must have at least one Asuryani unit per unit of one of these other choices. It seems like it's a fairly cool way of unifying the force, though I must admit it must be a bit annoying for anyone who's collected Ynnari armies and they've built them largely around the other two factions and not around the Craftworld so much. It does seem like it's at least a reasonable representation though of their fluff on the table. Basically, if you are playing Ynnari, you get a whole load of restrictions and things that you can't use, but you get quite a lot of benefits and other options that you can. You basically can't use the Runes of Fate on your Farseers at all, but you can use Fortune. You basically swap out the Runes of Fate for access to the Revenant Discipline, which we'll get onto. Ynnari Harlequins can't take pivotal roles. Ynnari Drakari can't take the Lords of Comera or favoured retinues, but I believe that you can take the Exarch Powers from the Asuryani. As mentioned, there's a bunch of Craftworld units that you can't take, and you can't play mix and match on transports, say for example putting Howling Banshees on Drakari Venoms, which I get why they do to try not to make them too weird and mixed, though it still would have been very cool. Also, in a slightly weird change in my opinion, Scourges cost 2 points more per model if they're Ynnari, and Incubi cost 4 points more per model. I don't know if this is literally just to represent that they're more sort of hired guns along for the Ynnari rather than the core of the force. Incubi already have had a points nerf for the Drakari, so this makes them really quite painful to take to be honest, and I'd be surprised if you take these rather than other options. For the good stuff though, they are still considered to be an Asuryani detachment, so get access to most of the things that they do. They get the Revenant Discipline for their Psykers, they get access to their 3 unique character datasheets, as we'll get onto in a second, and then basically they get the equivalent of an Eldar Craftworld's worth of options, so I'm afraid that they don't get massive amounts of extra Warlord traits, relics or stratagems anymore. I feel like as with Tower of Farsight enclaves, I wouldn't be too surprised to see an expanded supplement for Ynnari coming at some point in the edition. I kind of bet that that's going to crop up at some point in one of these campaign books. In any case, their equivalent of a Craftworld attribute is Strength from Death. They get to fight first in combat, and they take a leaf out of the Sisters of the Armata Lady book, and if they've taken a casualty in the unit, their entire unit gets +1 to hit at range and in melee. Maybe slightly more potent on really tanky things for Ynnari. I believe that you can field Wraith Blades for them. That would seem quite powerful, as they seem like they're a unit that's quite likely to take casualties, but not just get wiped out straight away. Fights first is kind of okay and helpful in ongoing combats, though still nowhere near as powerful as Fights last. Their Warlord trait allows you to regenerate 1 wound per command phase, and if he contacts any enemy units that are below starting strength, they get +1 attack or +1 strength when they're fighting them. A bit passable in my opinion, though nice and fluffy. The relic gives the character -1 damage and +1 save against any damage 1 weapons. Again, not going to hurt their durability, but not really going to make a fragile Aeldari character into a tanky one. Finally, for 1 CP, they have Inevitable Fate. This one can be used in the shooting or the fight phase, and when you target an enemy unit that's below half strength, you get +1 to wound against them. A pretty brutal way to really finish off an enemy unit there, though of course it does mean that you've had to do at least half of the work already. In terms of their attributes, stratagem and trait, I think it's all kind of okay, though not exactly stellar. I think really what sells them is the Revenant Discipline and also the 3 datasheets. Talking of which, the Revenant Discipline does return as a full 6 psychic powers. Gaze of a Need is quite similar, deals out some mortal wounds, you get a -2 to that roll if they're targeting a single model unit, so not quite as good for sniping characters and things. Storm of Whispers is warp charge 6 and 9 inches in range. You'd roll 3d6 dice for each enemy unit within 9 inches of the caster, and for each roll of a 4+, that unit takes a mortal wound. I feel like that one's a pretty solid one on something like the Incarn, hopefully popping up in the midst of the enemy army, and then hopefully threatening this on multiple units at once. Word of the Phoenix is warp charge 6 and 6 inches in range. This allows 1 Ynnari infantry unit that aren't Wraithguard to regenerate 1 model, and troop units get D3 models resurrected instead. This one's always going to be a pretty high value one, when you've got the potential to be resurrecting some really powerful models, say Warp Spiders, Fire Dragons or Dark Reapers perhaps. That's got the potential for quite a lot of threat to be returned to the board each turn. I feel like that one could be a pretty reasonable one to pick up. For Warp Charge 6 we have Unbind Souls. It's a debuff on an enemy unit in melee, and 6 is to hit in the fight phase, auto wound them. Good in combination with any low strength units that are going into combat. I feel like this is maybe even toned down compared with the previous though, as previously it'll let you re-roll the wound roll. Shield of a Need is a warp charge 6 12-inch power. You target 1 non-titanic Ynnari unit, it gains a 4+ invul, so it's going to be far harder to shift. Previously this was a bubble for a 5+ invul save. I think this one has its advantages and weaknesses. Seems like it could be quite solid on something like Eldar Guardians, or perhaps something like Eldar Vipers or Guardian Jetbikes perhaps. Anything that's fairly threatening, could be using its movement to get onto objectives, and then wants to make itself a real pain to remove. Again, I feel like that one could be a really easy one to play. There's going to be lots of good targets for that. Finally, Ancestor's Grace is a lot less redundant. Warp Charge 7 and 18-inch range. It gives you +1 to wound for any Ynnari unit in melee. Kind of a slight overlap with Warlock powers there, which you'd already have access to. This one doesn't have any restrictions about core or anything like that though, so you could potentially use it on really big threatening things. I believe you could even get that off on a Wraith Knight if you wanted. That would be some seriously scary stuff with that Ghost Glaive. Overall, I think it's an alright discipline. Maybe not quite as exciting as the standard Asuryani ones perhaps. I like the 4+ invul though, I like the +1 to wound, I like the resurrecting models, and Storm of Whispers seems good on the Incarn. Finally, let's talk through their 3 unique characters, starting with Yvraine. She's 135 points, going up from 120, and it's perhaps one of the most reliable places to get spells off from the Revenant Discipline, as she has a Gyrinx that allows her to reroll tests anymore, though she doesn't get +1 to cast and deny from it. Her swords become Strength +1, AP -3 and Damage 2, with wound rolls of 6 causing 2 mortal wounds and the attack sequence to end, and defensive wise she now has a 4+ invul and wound rolls of 1 to 3 always fail. Like the other datasheets here, she's both gained Battle Focus and Strands of Fate. She basically seems decent enough if you do want to get a couple of reliable psychic powers off. I will be weighing her up against a regular Farseer though, which would cost 45 points less, and maybe not do an enormous amount less. The Incarn, on the other hand, I think is looking super threatening now. Previously it was 290 points, it's been quite significantly dropped in points, and also looks far more dangerous. Like the Avatar of Cain, it's got a big boosted stat line, you can target it directly, but like the Cain Avatar, it gets a 4+ invul saves and halves damage, so it's not going to get gunned down anywhere particularly fast. It moves 10 inches, strength and toughness 7, 12 wounds, 6 attacks, has leadership 10 and a 3+ save. The blade is pretty brutal at strength +4, AP -4, damage D3 +3 and ignoring invuls. It basically makes the Incarn a pretty awesome character assassin, pointed at the biggest nastiest threat in the opponent's army. Hopefully it should go through most things in a single turn. It's picked up a minor shooting attack from that Swirling Soul energy. It's a 6-inch attack that has D6 shots, strength 7, AP -2, damage 1 and auto hits, but the fun part about this one is that it hits every single enemy unit within range, so potentially that could be 3 or 4 enemy units perhaps, if you can get him up close. Going to at least cause a bit of chip damage. If you roll high it could actually do serious damage to a 1 wound infantry unit though. Otherwise it's got Battle Focus and Strands of Fate, a 12-inch aura of ignores combat attrition modifiers much like the Avatar of Cain, and it still retains that pop-up ability when a unit dies, potentially teleporting to where one unit was killed, although it can't charge or declare a heroic intervention the same turn if it does. Puts a little bit of a limit on some of the gamiest things it can do, though still it's a really unsettling massive threat that you can have teleport across the table in the blink of an eye. I'd say perhaps the Incarn might be the single biggest draw to running Ynnari at the moment. It seems really quite an efficient model for 250 points, and really quite spooky with its redeployment things. It still remains a Revenant Cycler as well, and still casts 2 powers. Finally we have the Vizarch. He's 95 points, up from 85, and is a little bit tankier to take out now. He's got 6 wounds and a 2+ armor save. His snazzy sword seems to be following in the footsteps of the Incarn. It's strength +2, AP -4, damage 2, and it ignores invuls on a 4+, again meaning that he's going to be a fairly dangerous character assassin, a decent chance of just chewing through a lot of standard infantry commanders. He gets Battle Focus and Strands of Fate as well. You get to reroll hit rolls of 1 for Ynnari core units at range and in melee. A nice 6-inch aura there, and he now has the updated bodyguard rules for Yvraine, meaning that she just can't be shot when he's nearby, and he can be included slotless if she is present in a list. I guess could be an interesting alternative to an Autarch on foot. He's a little bit tougher, a bit fightier, and just commanding Ynnari in general is pretty handy. Still though, out of the units, I think that the Incarn remains my favourite. Overall, I would still say that Ynnari are probably improved just by the massive buffs to things like the Craftworld units and the Harlequins. They certainly seem like they could be fun to play around with, cherry-picking some of the best units from Craftworlds, Harlequins and Drukhari. I feel they just don't really scream raw strength straight away, but I think maybe with a mix of units, a few more interesting powers from the Revenant Discipline and that Incarn popping up, they do look like they're a force that's capable of being very threatening in the right hands. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our full review of the match play rules from Codex Aeldari. I must admit I knew this was going to be a monster book going into it, but I'm not sure I was expecting the review to take quite this long to make when I went into it. This has been by far the single most effort I've put into any single one YouTube review, as you can probably tell by the fact that the thing's gone on for over 2.5 hours now. I hope you found at least some of it useful. Overall, I think it's looking like a great time to be collecting space elves of just about any flight. I'll be interested to see what sort of combos people put together with the new codex, and I'll hopefully do a few unit reviews, army lists, and faction review videos. It'll be good to talk a bit more Eldar over the next few weeks, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that. Finally, I'd just like to quickly mention the channel's Patreon page, which is the thing that allows me to spend quite so much crazy time and effort on single videos like this. Reviews like this would just simply not be possible if I was trying to juggle YouTube work with another full-time job. A massive thank you to any of you guys who are supporting over there. It is what makes this channel possible. And if you have been enjoying quite a bit, any support on the Patreon page is enormously appreciated. You can find the link to it down in the video description if you're interested. As well as just letting me make big reviews like this, the channel's Patreon page does have a few rewards, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.